The blade known as World's End slid into its scabbard with a final, metallic sigh. Kael stood in the throne room of the obsidian citadel, the air thick with the scent of ozone and old blood. For centuries, this had been his home, or rather, his battlefield. The towering obsidian pillars, carved with the faces of forgotten demons, seemed to lean in as if whispering his name one last time. Before him, the demon lord sat upon a throne of fused bone, his form shifting between shadow and terrible clarity. "You're certain, Kael," the demon lord's voice echoed, not from his mouth but from the very stones. "The wars are not yet won. The mortal kingdoms still resist." Kael met those swirling, crimson eyes without flinching. He was tall, his frame lean but corded with the muscle of countless battles, his hair the color of ash and his face bearing the faint scars of 1,000 skirmishes. Yet, in his own amber eyes, there was a weariness that no victory could erase. "I am certain, my lord," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I have spilled enough blood for a dozen eternities. Let the others have their glory. I want silence." He didn't wait for permission. Turning on his heel, his black armor, once polished to a deadly sheen, now dull with the grime of his final campaign, he walked out of the throne room. The demonic guards, hulking brutes with serrated horns, parted without a word. They knew better than to challenge the right hand, even in departure. As he passed through the citadel's gates, the cacophony of the underworld, the screams of the damned, the clang of forges, faded behind him like a bad dream. 2 weeks later, Kael stood at the edge of a remote valley in the northern reaches of the mortal realm. The air here was clean, scented with pine and damp earth. Before him lay a dilapidated farmstead, a small stone cottage with a sagging roof, a overgrown garden, and a wooden fence that had long since surrendered to moss and rot. He'd purchased it with a bag of gold coins looted from a king's treasury centuries ago, a fitting irony, he thought. The previous owner, a reclusive hermit, had died of old age, leaving the land to the whims of nature. Kael set down his pack, which contained only the essentials, a change of simple clothes, a few cooking utensils, and World's End, now wrapped in plain cloth. He took a deep breath, the first in what felt like an age that didn't taste of smoke or iron. "This is it," he murmured to himself, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Retirement. His first act was not to unpack, but to kneel in the center of the overgrown yard. Closing his eyes, he reached inward, to the core of his being where a dormant power slumbered. The Aegis of the Last Stand, a conceptual defense system he'd forged during a lull in the endless wars, a secret even the demon lord didn't fully comprehend. It was born from his deepest desire, a place where nothing could harm him or his. With a whispered incantation in a language older than demons, he activated it. A ripple spread from him, invisible but palpable. It washed over the cottage, the garden, the fence, and the surrounding acre of land. The air shimmered faintly, like heat haze on a summer day, then settled. Kael felt it settle into the very soil, a barrier that would repel any hostile magic, curse or physical force. No invasion, no attack, no malice could breach it. Here, he was safe. Here, he could finally rest. He spent the next few days in a blur of simple labor. With hands that had once shattered castle gates, he repaired the cottage's roof, patching holes with wood from the nearby forest. He cleared the garden of weeds, his movements methodical, almost meditative. There was no rush, no deadline. He brewed tea from wild herbs he gathered, savoring the subtle flavors, a far cry from the bitter potions of war. At night, he slept on a straw mattress, the silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. In his dreams, he no longer saw battlefields, but fields of wildflowers. On the 4th day, with the cottage habitable and a small vegetable plot sown, Kael decided to explore the edges of his new domain. The Aegis extended about a mile in all directions, marked by an invisible boundary he could sense like a gentle hum. He walked through the forest, the sunlight dappling through the canopy of ancient oaks. Birds chirped overhead, and a squirrel scampered up a trunk, unafraid. Kael marveled at it all. After centuries of noise and chaos, this tranquility was almost overwhelming. It was near a babbling brook, where the water ran clear over smooth stones, that he heard it, a faint, pitiful whining. It was high-pitched, almost like a wounded animal. Kael frowned, his instincts, honed by lifetimes of conflict, immediately assessing for threat. But the Aegis hummed steadily, no danger registered. He followed the sound, pushing through a thicket of ferns. There, in a small clearing, he saw it. A tiny creature was caught in a rusted iron trap, the kind hunters used for small game. It was no larger than a house cat, with obsidian scales that gleamed dully in the filtered light. It had 4 stubby legs, a whip-like tail, and a head that seemed too big for its body, with 2 nubs where horns might one day grow. Its eyes were wide, golden orbs filled with pain and confusion. It whined again, a sound that tugged at something deep in Kael's chest. A puppy? Kael muttered, crouching down. He'd seen many strange beasts in his time, but this one looked odd. The scales were unusual, but in the mortal realm, magical creatures sometimes had odd traits. Perhaps it was a rare breed, lost from some noble's menagerie. Its whining grew more desperate as it struggled against the trap's jaws, which had clamped around one of its hind legs. Tiny sparks of dark energy flickered around the wound, but they dissipated harmlessly against the Aegis's influence. "Shoo, easy there," Kael said, his voice softer than he'd used in centuries. He reached out, his hands, calloused from sword grips, moving with surprising gentleness. The creature flinched but didn't snap at him. Its eyes locked onto his, and in that moment, Kael saw not a monster, but something vulnerable and scared. He'd seen that look in the eyes of soldiers and civilians alike, and it always stirred a pang of empathy he'd long suppressed. With careful precision, he pried open the trap's jaws. They were stiff with rust, but his strength made it effortless. The creature pulled its leg free, letting out a relieved whimper. It tried to stand, wobbling on 3 legs, the injured one held awkwardly. Kael examined the wound. It was shallow, the scales only bruised, thanks to the trap's age. Those dark sparks had likely been some minor magical defense, now nullified by the Aegis. "You're lucky I found you," Kael said, scooping the creature into his arms. It was lighter than he expected, its scales cool to the touch. It nestled against his chest, its whining subsiding into a soft, rumbling purr. "Lost your family, huh? Well, you can stay with me. This farm could use a guard dog, or whatever you are." He carried it back to the cottage, its golden eyes watching the world pass by with curiosity. In the garden, he cleaned the wound with water from the well, then wrapped it in a strip of clean cloth. The creature, he decided to call it Sparky, for the odd energy he'd seen, seemed to enjoy the attention, nuzzling his hand with a snout that felt like polished stone. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and purple, Kael sat on the porch of his cottage, a cup of herbal tea steaming in his hand. Sparky lay in his lap, curled into a tight ball, already asleep. The creature's breathing was steady, its scales catching the last light in iridescent flashes. Kael sipped his tea, feeling a contentment he hadn't known was possible. This was retirement, no battles, no orders, just the quiet companionship of a rescued animal and the inviolable peace of his land. But as darkness fell and the first stars emerged, something shifted. Sparky stirred in its sleep, emitting a faint, almost imperceptible glow. It wasn't bright, just a soft shimmer around its scales, like starlight trapped in obsidian. The air around it seemed to waver, as if reality itself was bending slightly, subtly. A tiny crackle of energy, not dark this time but cosmic in hue, flickered at the tips of its nubbed horns. Kael noticed it out of the corner of his eye, but he dismissed it as a trick of the light or some residual magic from the forest. To him, it was just his new puppy, dreaming peacefully. He didn't see how, in that glow, the very fabric of space around Sparky twisted infinitesimally, or how distant constellations seemed to pulse in response. He didn't know that in far-off kingdoms, seers jolted awake from prophecies of a world-ender, or that in the depths of the underworld, the demon lord felt a tremor in the ley lines. All Kael knew was the warmth in his lap and the silence of the night. He finished his tea, set the cup aside, and leaned back, his own eyes closing. Tomorrow, he'd tend the garden and maybe carve a toy for Sparky. For now, retirement was perfect. And as Sparky slept, its glow faded, leaving only the gentle hum of the Aegis and the promise of a peace that was, unbeknownst to Kael, far more fragile than it seemed. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Kael's farmhouse kitchen, painting golden stripes across the worn wooden floorboards. Steam rose from the ceramic teapot in gentle spirals, carrying the scent of mountain herbs Kael had gathered yesterday. He sat at the simple oak table, his hands, once accustomed to gripping the hilt of a world-ending blade, now cradling a chipped porcelain cup with deliberate care. Across the room, Sparky lay curled on a patch of sunlight near the hearth. The creature had grown noticeably overnight. What yesterday had been a creature small enough to fit in Kael's palm now stretched nearly 2 feet from nose to tail tip. Its obsidian scales caught the light with an iridescent sheen, shifting from deep black to hints of violet and emerald when the angle changed. Kael watched it sleep, the steady rise and fall of its sides almost hypnotic. Just a fast-growing breed, Kael murmured to himself, taking a sip of tea. Probably some exotic magical crossbreed someone abandoned. He'd spent centuries recognizing threats, the subtle shift in a battlefield's energy before an ambush, the telltale shimmer of a hidden curse, the cold calculation in an enemy's eyes. But this? This was different. This was peace. The Aegis hummed quietly at the edge of his awareness, a constant, comforting presence that made the very air of his farmstead feel still and safe, like the eye of a storm. After finishing his tea, Kael moved to the garden. The farmstead spanned several acres, a modest vegetable patch near the house, an herb garden, a small orchard of fruit trees, and beyond that, wild meadows that sloped down to a crystal-clear stream. He'd chosen this remote valley specifically for its isolation, nestled between the whispering peaks and the elderwood forest. No roads led here, only deer trails and the occasional game path. As he knelt to weed the carrot beds, Sparky padded out to join him. The creature moved with an odd grace, its paws, still disproportionately large for its body, making almost no sound on the soft earth. It sniffed at the plants, then wandered over to where Kael had left his gardening tools leaning against the fence. Kael watched from the corner of his eye as Sparky nosed at the trowel. The tool was nothing special, just ordinary iron, but the handle bore a minor enchantment Kael had placed on it weeks ago, a simple durability charm to prevent rust and breakage. Sparky's nostrils flared, and it began chewing on the wooden handle with focused intensity. "Hey now," Kael said mildly, not looking up from his weeding. "That's not food." Sparky ignored him, gnawing with growing enthusiasm. Kael sighed and stood, brushing dirt from his knees. As he approached, he noticed something peculiar. Where Sparky's teeth met the enchanted wood, tiny sparks of silver light flickered and died. The enchantment on the tool was being consumed. Not broken, not dispelled, but absorbed. Kael froze, centuries of magical knowledge surfacing despite his retirement. "That's not possible," he whispered. Passive magical consumption was a trait of only the most ancient and powerful beings, dragons of legend, primordial spirits, entities that predated mortal magic. But Sparky just looked up at him with those large, dark eyes, gave a happy little wiggle, and went back to chewing. Kael reached down slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. He'd handled dangerous beasts before, hellhounds, shadow stalkers, chaos-spawned abominations. But this felt different. This felt like a puppy. A very strange puppy that ate magic. "Let's find you something better," Kael said, prying the trowel from Sparky's mouth. The enchantment was completely gone, leaving ordinary, slightly damp wood. He returned to the house, Sparky trotting at his heels. In the storage room, he rummaged through a chest of miscellaneous items, relics from his old life he hadn't had the heart to discard. His fingers brushed against a small, smooth stone about the size of his thumb. A focusing crystal, once used to channel minor offensive spells. It held a residual charge, barely enough to light a candle. Kael placed it on the floor. "Try this." Sparky sniffed it, then picked it up delicately in its mouth. There was a soft crunching sound, like glass breaking under pressure, and the crystal dissolved into shimmering dust that Sparky swallowed with apparent satisfaction. The creature let out a contented sigh and curled up at Kael's feet. "Well," Kael said aloud to the empty room. "That's certainly unusual." But the Aegis remained calm, undisturbed. Whatever Sparky was, it posed no threat here. Not within these boundaries. Kael decided to file the observation away for later consideration and return to his gardening. The day passed in quiet rhythm. Kael tended his plants, repaired a section of fence that had sagged, and prepared a simple stew for lunch. Sparky followed him everywhere, its growth continuing at a visible pace. By afternoon, it was the size of a medium dog, though its proportions remained awkward, long body, oversized paws, and a tail that seemed to flicker at the very edge of perception, as if not entirely anchored to reality. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, a visitor arrived. Kael heard her before he saw her, the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path that led from the forest edge to his farmhouse. He'd been pruning the apple trees, Sparky dozing in the shade beneath them. The creature's ears twitched, but it didn't wake. "Hello," a woman's voice called out, melodic and cautious. "Is anyone home?" Kael wiped his hands on his trousers and walked around the side of the house. The woman standing at his gate was perhaps in her late 20s, with sun-streaked brown hair tied back in a practical braid. She wore simple traveling clothes, a green tunic, brown trousers, and sturdy boots. A woven basket hung from one arm, filled with various plants and herbs. What caught Kael's attention were her eyes, a clear, sharp green that missed nothing as they scanned his property. "Can I help you?" Kael asked, keeping his tone neutral but friendly. I'm Elara, she said, offering a small smile. The herbalist from Oakhaven village, about a day's walk southeast. I was gathering moonbloom in the elderwood and noticed your farm. I haven't seen anyone living this deep in the valley before. Kael, he replied, opening the gate. I moved in recently. Looking for some peace and quiet. You've certainly found it, Elara said, stepping through. Her gaze swept across the garden, the house, the surrounding land. She paused, her brow furrowing slightly. There's a stillness here. Like the air before a storm, but without the tension. Kael kept his expression placid. Mountain air. Clean and fresh. It's more than that, Elara murmured, almost to herself. She shook her head as if clearing it. Sorry. I have a sensitivity to magic. Old family trait. Your land feels ancient. Protected. Just lucky, I suppose, Kael said, gesturing toward the house. Would you like some tea? I was about to brew a fresh pot. That would be lovely, thank you. As they walked to the house, Sparky emerged from beneath the apple tree, stretching with a yawn that revealed a mouthful of needle-sharp teeth. Elara stopped dead, her basket slipping slightly in her grip. What is that? She breathed. My dog, Kael said easily. Sparky. Found him caught in a trap yesterday. Poor thing was terrified. Sparky trotted over and nudged Kael's hand with its head, demanding attention. Kael scratched behind its ears, and the creature made a rumbling sound that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. That's no dog, Elara said, but she didn't sound afraid. Curious, yes. Wary, certainly. But not afraid. She knelt slowly, holding out her hand for Sparky to sniff. Its scales. I've never seen anything like them. And the energy around it. She trailed off, her eyes narrowing in concentration. Sparky sniffed her fingers, then licked them once before losing interest and wandering back to the apple tree. He's harmless, Kael said, and it wasn't entirely a lie. Within the Aegis, Sparky was as harmless as any pet. Come inside. The farmhouse interior was Spartan but comfortable. Kael hadn't brought much with him, a few pieces of furniture, some kitchenware, books. Nothing that spoke of his past. Nothing that hinted at centuries of warfare and darkness. He busied himself with the tea while Elara sat at the table, her basket placed carefully beside her. You have quite a collection, Kael noted, nodding to her herbs as he set 2 cups on the table. Moonbloom, silverleaf, dreamroot, Elara said, touching each plant with practiced familiarity. They only grow in specific places. Places where the veil between worlds is thin, or where old magic has seeped into the soil. She looked up at him. Your land is rich with them. I found patches growing wild just beyond your fence that would take years to cultivate elsewhere. Like I said, Kael poured the tea, lucky. They drank in companionable silence for a few moments. Through the window, Kael could see Sparky digging at something near the fence line. Dirt flew in impressive arcs. Your dog, Elara began carefully. Has it shown any unusual behaviors? Beyond the obvious physical traits. He likes to chew on things, Kael said. Especially anything with a bit of magic to it. Elara's eyes widened slightly. Magic consumption. That's a documented trait of, she cut herself off, shaking her head. No. It can't be. The legends say they're all gone, or sleeping, or... She took a steadying sip of tea. Forgive me. I study old lore as a hobby. Sometimes my imagination runs away with me. What do the legends say? Kael asked, genuinely curious. He knew plenty about demons, about dark magic, about the mechanics of war and conquest. But ancient lore? That had never been his area of expertise. There are stories, Elara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper as if sharing a secret. From before the kingdoms, before the demon wars, before recorded history. Stories of creatures born from the fabric of reality itself. Beings of pure potential who could reshape the world with a thought. Some texts call them world shapers. Others. World enders. Sparky chose that moment to trot back to the house, something metallic and shiny clamped in his jaws. He dropped it at Kael's feet with a proud wag of his tail. It was a broken piece of armor, a pauldron from what looked like a knight's suit, etched with fading enchantments. Where had he found that? That's... Elara leaned forward, her herbalist's eyes recognizing the craftsmanship. That's at least 300 years old. Imperial Guard issue, from the look of the markings. And the enchantments, protective wards against demonic influence. Sparky whined and nudged the pauldron with his nose. He wants you to throw it, Kael interpreted. He picked up the piece of armor, heavy, cold iron, and tossed it across the yard. Sparky bounded after it, his movements blurring slightly at the edges as if he weren't entirely moving through normal space. Elara watched, her tea forgotten. Kael, she said slowly. Where exactly did you find Sparky? In a trap about half a mile into the Elderwood, Kael said. Why? The Elderwood. Elara's fingers tightened around her cup. There are ruins there. Very old ruins. Older than the empires. The locals avoid them. They say the stones whisper, and sometimes things come out of the deep places. Sparky's just a lost animal, Kael said firmly. Nothing more. But even as he said it, he remembered the reality-warping glow from the night before. The way Sparky's growth defied natural law. The consumption of magic. He pushed the thoughts aside. The Aegis held. That was all that mattered. Elara finished her tea and stood. I should be going. It's a long walk back to Oakhaven, and I want to reach the forest edge before full dark. She hesitated at the door. Kael, be careful. The world isn't as peaceful as it seems. There are eyes everywhere, especially in remote places like this. Thank you for the warning, Kael said. And for the company. After Elara had disappeared down the path, swallowed by the gathering twilight, Kael cleaned up the tea things. Sparky came inside, his size now that of a large wolf, though he still moved with puppyish clumsiness. He curled up on the rug before the cold hearth, watching Kael with those dark, intelligent eyes. As night fell completely, Kael lit a single lantern and sat in his chair with a book, a treatise on agricultural techniques he'd picked up in the last town. He read for an hour, the words blurring as fatigue set in. Retirement was exhausting in its own way, he mused. The absence of constant vigilance, of threat assessment, of battle readiness, it left a strange emptiness that ordinary tasks couldn't quite fill. A soft sound made him look up. Sparky was awake, sitting upright on the rug. The creature's eyes were open wide, and they were no longer dark. They glowed with a cosmic light, swirls of nebula colors, pinpricks of starlight, the slow dance of galaxies being born and dying. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with potential. Kael could feel reality straining at the edges, like a canvas stretched too tight. He set his book aside. Sparky. The glow intensified for a moment, then faded. Sparky blinked, shook his head as if clearing water from his ears, and trotted over to rest his head on Kael's knee. The moment passed. The Aegis hummed, undisturbed. But far away, beyond the valley, in places where magic was watched and measured and feared, alarms sounded. In the Royal Observatory of the Sunstone Kingdom, a scrying crystal that had been dark for centuries flared to life, showing a location deep in the northern wilderness. The mage on duty fumbled for his quill, hands trembling as he transcribed the coordinates. In the hidden chambers of the Arcane Council, a map of magical anomalies updated itself, a new and blazing red dot appearing where before there had been nothing but empty mountains. And in the war room of the Demon Lord's fortress, a communication orb crackled to life. The voice that emerged was raspy, strained with distance and poor connection. Scouting report. Northern Valley between Whispering Peaks and Elderwood. Detected, something. Reality distortion. Scale, catastrophic. Recommend immediate investigation. The response was a single word, spoken in a voice like grinding stone. Confirmed. Back on his farm, Kael stroked Sparky's head, feeling the smooth, cool scales beneath his fingers. The creature sighed contentedly, its eyes closing. Outside, the first stars appeared in the velvet sky, and the moon rose over the peaks, bathing the valley in silver light. Peace, Kael thought. This was what he'd fought for. This was what he'd earned. He didn't see the shadows moving at the edge of his property, figures cloaked in darkness, observing, recording, then melting back into the forest. He didn't hear the soft rustle of wings as a messenger bird took flight, carrying a scrap of parchment toward distant kingdoms. All he saw was his farm, his home, his strange new companion. And for now, that was enough. The morning sun painted Kael's farm in soft gold, dew clinging to the leaves of his herb garden like scattered diamonds. He knelt by a patch of moon blossoms, humming an old demonic marching tune under his breath as he trimmed away wilted petals. Retirement, he mused, was a symphony of small pleasures, the scent of damp earth, the warmth of sunlight on his back, the quiet companionship of his peculiar pet. Sparky lay sprawled nearby, a bundle of obsidian scales that had grown to the size of a large hound in just a few weeks. The creature's snout rested on its paws, eyes closed in a contented doze. But even in sleep, there was an oddness to it. The air around Sparky shimmered faintly, as if reality itself were bending to accommodate its presence. Kael had noticed the phenomenon but dismissed it as a quirk of the Aegis. After all, his land was saturated with protective magic, a few visual distortions were hardly worth fretting over. He'd just finished pruning when a distant sound caught his attention, the rhythmic clatter of hooves on the packed dirt road leading to his farm. Kael straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers. Visitors were rare this far into the hinterlands, and the last one had been Alara, the herbalist with her keen eyes and gentle curiosity. This sounded like more than a single traveler. Sparky's ears twitched, and one golden eye slit open. A low rumble vibrated in its throat, not quite a growl, but a sound of mild interest. Kael patted its head. "Easy, boy. Probably just lost merchants." But as the riders crested the hill, Kael's retired instincts stirred. These were no merchants. 10 figures on horseback, clad in polished steel plate emblazoned with the crest of the royal kingdom, a soaring griffin against a field of blue. Sunlight glinted off their armor, and their movements were too disciplined, too purposeful. At their head rode a man with a plume of crimson feathers on his helm, his face set in lines of grim determination. Sir Gareth, Knight Captain of the Royal Guard, reined his horse to a halt just beyond the wooden gate that marked the boundary of Kael's property. His eyes swept over the farm, the cozy cottage with its thatched roof, the well-tended gardens, the strange obsidian creature lounging in the grass, and his lips tightened. This was the place. The scouts' reports had been clear, reality-warping energies, localized here. The apocalypse beast was here, masquerading as some farmer's pet. "Hail, farmer!" Gareth called out, his voice carrying the weight of command. "I am Sir Gareth, acting under the authority of His Majesty, King Alastair III. We have come for the beast you harbor." Kael ambled toward the gate, his movements unhurried. He'd faced down charging demon hordes with less concern than he felt now. These nights were an interruption to his morning, nothing more. "Good morning," he said, offering a polite nod. "I'm afraid I don't have any beasts here. Just me and my dog, Sparky." Gareth's gaze snapped to Sparky, who had risen to its feet and was now stretching with a yawn that revealed a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth. The creature's eyes, when fully open, held flecks of starlight deep within. "That is no dog," Gareth said, his hand dropping to the hilt of his sword. "That is the world-ender dragon, a creature of prophecy destined to unravel creation itself. You will surrender it immediately, or face the consequences." Kael sighed inwardly. So, the rumors had spread faster than he'd anticipated. He'd hoped for a few more months of peace before the world came knocking. Outwardly, he maintained a placid smile. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Sparky's a bit unusual, I'll grant you, but he's harmless. Would you care for some tea? I've just brewed a fresh pot of sunleaf blend." For a moment, Gareth simply stared, as if unable to process the offer. Tea. While the apocalypse lounged in the grass. His knights shifted in their saddles, exchanging uncertain glances. The farmer's calm was unnerving. "This is not a social call," Gareth said, his voice hardening. "That creature is a threat to all living things. By order of the crown, I demand you hand it over." Kael leaned against the gatepost, crossing his arms. "And if I refuse? Then we will take it by force." Gareth drew his sword, the steel ringing in the morning air. Behind him, his knights followed suit, blades gleaming. 2 of them, mages by their robes, began to chant, gathering mana for offensive spells. Sparky padded over to stand beside Kael, its head cocked. It didn't seem alarmed, if anything, it looked bored. Kael scratched behind its ears. "You see? He's perfectly tame. Now, about that tea." "Enough." Gareth barked. "Knights, advance. Mages, fire." What happened next would be recounted in tavern tales for years to come, though none who witnessed it truly understood. The knights spurred their horses forward, only to pull up short as their mounts refused to cross the gate's threshold. The horses snorted and reared, eyes rolling in panic, as if confronted by an invisible wall. Gareth dismounted, striding forward on foot, his sword raised high. He brought the blade down in a sweeping arc aimed at Kael's head, only for it to stop mere inches from its target, as if striking solid stone. There was no impact, no sound of metal on shield, the sword simply lost all momentum, hanging uselessly in the air. Gareth's arms trembled with the effort, but he couldn't advance the blade another fraction. At the same time, the mages released their spells, a searing bolt of fire and a crackling lance of lightning. The fireball fizzled into harmless sparks a foot from the gate, while the lightning forked away harmlessly into the sky, as if diverted by an unseen hand. The mages stared, their chants dying on their lips. Kael hadn't moved. He watched with mild interest, as one might watch children play at war. The Aegis of the last stand, he said conversationally. Makes my land inviolable. No hostile magic or force can touch it. Or me, for that matter. Gareth stumbled back, his face pale. What sorcery is this? Not sorcery. Just a little retirement perk. Kael gestured toward the cottage. Sure you won't stay for tea? It's getting cold. For a long moment, the knights stood in stunned silence. Sparky chose that moment to yawn again, a sound that seemed to echo with the faint resonance of distant stars. Then it trotted over to a patch of clover and began nibbling at the leaves, utterly unconcerned. Gareth's pride warred with his confusion. He was a knight of the realm, sworn to protect it from threats. But how could he fight an enemy he couldn't even touch? His mind raced, perhaps siege weapons, or greater numbers, or, no, the reports had mentioned this phenomenon. The farmer's land was protected by something beyond their understanding. This isn't over, he said, sheathing his sword with a sharp click. That beast cannot be allowed to remain. We will return with the full might of the kingdom. Kael shrugged. Suit yourself. But do knock next time. It's only polite. With a final, furious glare, Gareth mounted his horse and signaled retreat. The knights turned their steeds, riding back the way they'd come, their earlier confidence replaced by bewildered murmurs. Kael watched them go, then turned to Sparky, who was now rolling in the clover, its legs kicking playfully. Well, that was rude, Kael said, shaking his head. And here I was, looking forward to a quiet day. He walked back to his garden, retrieving his pruning shears. The encounter had stirred old memories, the clash of armies, the scent of blood and ozone, the weight of command. But those days were behind him. Now, his greatest concern was whether the moonblossoms would bloom in time for Alara's next visit. Yet, as he worked, a part of him remained alert. Gareth's threat hadn't been empty. The royal court would send more forces, and likely smarter ones. The Aegis was impregnable, but Kael's peace was fragile. He glanced at Sparky, who had fallen asleep again, its sides rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The creature's scales seemed darker today, absorbing the sunlight rather than reflecting it. Kael felt a flicker of unease, not fear, but the cautious wariness of a soldier who knew that battles were often won before the first sword was drawn. He finished his gardening and went inside to brew a fresh pot of tea. The sun climbed higher, and the farm returned to its tranquil rhythm. But far down the road, Sir Gareth was already dictating a message to a courier, his words sharp with urgency. Tell the court we found the dragon. It's guarded by a farmer with impossible defenses. We need archmages, siege engines, everything. And hurry, before that beast decides to stop playing docile. The courier galloped away, dust rising in his wake. Gareth watched the farm shrink in the distance, his jaw set. He didn't understand the magic at work, but he understood duty. They would break that barrier, one way or another. The apocalypse could not be allowed a retirement. Back at the farm, Kael sipped his tea on the porch, Sparky curled at his feet. The breeze carried the scent of blooming herbs, and for a moment, all was right in his small corner of the world. But in the back of his mind, a plan began to form, a way to perhaps negotiate, to explain, to avoid further conflict. He was retired, yes, but he'd never been one to hide from problems. He just preferred to solve them with minimal fuss. As the day wore on, Sparky's sleep grew deeper, and its scales began to emit a soft, pulsing glow, the same reality-warping energy the scouts had detected. Kael noticed it this time, frowning. What are you, really, he murmured, but the creature only sighed in its sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, there was tea, and sunshine, and the simple joy of a garden tended by hand. Kael leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. Let the kingdoms rage. His gate would hold. The morning after the night's retreat dawned with a peculiar stillness over Kael's farm. Mist clung to the rolling hills like gossamer veils, and the air carried the crisp scent of dew-kissed grass and blooming nightshade. Kael stood on his porch, a steaming cup of jasmine tea cradled in his hands, watching as Sparky chased after a sunbeam that fractured through the canopy of ancient oaks bordering his land. The creature, now roughly the size of a large hound, its obsidian scales catching the light in prismatic flashes, pounced on the spot with a playful yip, then rolled onto its back, stubby legs kicking at the air. Kael smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the tea. Centuries of battlefield tension had melted from his shoulders these past weeks, replaced by the simple rhythm of tending his garden, brewing herbal infusions, and watching Sparky grow. Yet, he couldn't ignore the subtle changes. Just yesterday, he'd found one of his enchanted trowels, a relic from his demonic days, capable of self-sharpening, reduced to a pile of glittering dust in Sparky's bed. The dragon had looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes, a faint shimmer of cosmic energy fading from its pupils. "You're a curious one, aren't you?" Kael murmured, setting his cup on the porch railing. He descended the steps, his boots crunching on the gravel path that wound through his herb garden. Sparky scrambled to its feet and trotted over, nuzzling his leg with a cool, scaled snout. Kael reached down, scratching behind the dragon's ear-like frills. "Hungry for magic, it seems. Well, let's see if you can learn something useful today." He pulled a simple wooden stick from a pile of kindling nearby, mundane, unenchanted, safe. Holding it up, he said, "Fetch, Sparky." "Go on, fetch," and tossed it toward the gate at the edge of his property. The stick arced through the air, landing with a soft thud in the grass just inside the boundary marked by a low stone wall. Sparky tilted its head, then bounded after it, movements fluid and oddly graceful for a creature still figuring out its limbs. Kael watched, his senses, honed over lifetimes of conflict, already prickling. The mist beyond his gate was thickening, not with natural fog, but with a coalescence of arcane energy. He could feel it like a distant hum, the vibration of spellcraft gathering. He sighed, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair. So soon. I'd hoped for at least a week of peace. By mid-morning, they arrived. A procession of 7 figures clad in deep violet robes embroidered with silver runes emerged from the tree line, moving with deliberate, measured steps. They carried no weapons, but the air around them crackled with latent power. At their head was Arcanist Lyra, a woman with sharp features, eyes the color of storm clouds, and a bearing that spoke of absolute confidence in her craft. She held a staff of polished elderwood, its tip glowing with a soft, pulsating light. Lyra stopped a respectful distance from Kael's gate, her gaze sweeping over the farm with analytical precision. She noted the vibrant, almost unnaturally healthy crops, the serene atmosphere that seemed to repel even the faintest whisper of malice, and the obsidian-scaled creature currently trotting back to its master with a stick in its jaws. Her lips thinned. "So this is the place," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet field. "The epicenter of the disturbance. The lair of the world ender." Kael, who had settled onto a tree stump near his porch, accepted the stick from Sparky and patted its head. "Good boy," he said, then looked toward the gate. "Morning. Can I help you?" Lyra's eyes narrowed. She had expected fortifications, traps, perhaps a crazed hermit raving about doom. Not this, domesticity. "I am Arcanist Lyra, head of the Royal College of Thaumaturgy. We have come to neutralize the apocalyptic threat residing on this land. The creature you call a pet is, in fact, the dragon of prophecy, destined to unravel reality itself." Kael tossed the stick again, this time a little farther. Sparky dashed off, tail wagging. "Is that so? Well, Sparky here is still working on sit, so I think unraveling reality might be a bit advanced for him. Would you like some tea? I've just brewed a fresh pot of chamomile." A younger mage behind Lyra snorted, then quickly composed himself under her withering glare. Lyra's grip tightened on her staff. "Your flippancy is noted, but irrelevant. We have analyzed the reports from Sir Gareth's knights. This land is protected by a powerful ward, one that nullifies hostile magic and force. We are here to dispel it." "Ah," Kael said, leaning back. "The Aegis. Yes, it's quite effective. Saves on repair costs." Lyra ignored the comment, turning to her team. "Positions. Set up the circle of unbinding. We will peel back this defense layer by layer." The mages fanned out, forming a wide semicircle around the gate. From pouches at their belts, they produced crystals, incense burners, and scrolls etched with glowing sigils. They began to chant in a low, resonant harmony, the words ancient and heavy with power. The air grew thick, charged with ozone, and the ground trembled faintly. Lyra raised her staff, its glow intensifying, and began to weave complex gestures with her free hand, threads of violet light spiraling from her fingertips to join the forming ritual. Kael watched with mild interest, sipping his tea. Sparky returned with the stick, dropping it at his feet, then sat, panting lightly. Its eyes followed the mage's, not with alarm, but with a curious tilt of its head, as if watching a particularly elaborate puppet show. Kael scratched under its chin. See that? They're trying very hard. It's almost admirable. Lyra's chant rose to a crescendo. By the roots of Yggdrasil and the veins of the ley lines, we command the barriers to fall. Unravel, unbind, unveil. A vortex of energy swirled above the mages, coalescing into a spear of pure arcane force aimed directly at the gate. With a final, shouted syllable, Lyra thrust her staff forward, and the spear shot toward the boundary. It struck the invisible field of the Aegis with a sound like shattering glass. Instead of penetrating, the spear fragmented into 1,000 harmless shards of light that dissipated into the mist. The backlash was immediate. The circle of unbinding flared violently, the runes on the scrolls burning out in quick succession. One of the younger mages yelped as his crystal overheated and exploded into dust, showering him with harmless but embarrassing glitter. Another stumbled back, his chant turning into a cough as the incense smoke reversed direction, billowing into his face. Lyra staggered, her staff's glow flickering. She stared, disbelief etching lines into her features. Impossible. That ritual should have dismantled any ward short of divine intervention. Kael set down his teacup and stood, brushing off his trousers. I did try to warn you. The Aegis isn't just a ward, it's a conceptual defense. It doesn't resist, it simply defines this land and those under my protection as inviolable. You can't dispel an idea with a bigger spell. Sparky, perhaps sensing the tension, let out a soft whine and nudged Kael's hand. He absently petted the dragon, his eyes never leaving Lyra. Now, if you're done, I have gardening to do. The basil won't water itself. Humiliation burned in Lyra's chest, hot and sharp. She had led expeditions into cursed ruins, bargained with elementals, and advised kings. Never had she been so thoroughly, so casually thwarted. Her team was muttering, casting nervous glances at the farm and the unassuming man who stood there, utterly unimpressed. She forced herself to breathe, to think. This was no ordinary hermit. The way he moved, the calm in his eyes, the sheer, effortless power that radiated from this place, it spoke of something deeper. Who are you? She demanded, her voice losing some of its earlier certainty. No simple farmer commands such defenses. That creature, she pointed at Sparky, who was now chewing contentedly on the stick, is a being of cataclysmic power. Yet it behaves like a common hound. How? Kael shrugged, a gesture that was both dismissive and oddly weary. I'm retired. As for Sparky, he's just a puppy who likes belly rubs. Maybe your prophecies need updating. Lyra's mind raced, connecting fragments. The inviolable land. The pacified apocalypse beast. The man's ageless demeanor, the subtle scars on his hands that spoke of blade work, not farming. And that name, Kael. It tugged at a memory, buried deep in the archives of forbidden knowledge she had studied in her youth. Tales from the demon wars, centuries past, of a general so feared they called him the right hand of the demon lord. A being of immortal cunning and power, who vanished after the last great conflict. Her blood ran cold. Could it be? No, it was absurd. That figure was a legend, a monster from bedtime stories used to scare novice mages. But legends had roots in truth. She looked at Kael again, really looked, and saw past the simple clothes and gentle smile. In the set of his shoulders, the watchfulness in his gaze, she recognized the bearing of a warrior who had walked through fields of carnage and emerged, bored. We're leaving, Lyra announced abruptly, cutting off the murmurs of her team. She lowered her staff, its light dimming to a dull gleam. This endeavor is futile for now. One of the mages, a man with a singed robe, protested. Arcanist, we can try the ritual of sundering. It requires more preparation, but... No, Lyra said, her tone brooking no argument. We retreat. Gather the components. We return to the college. She turned her back on the farm, her thoughts churning. As her team packed up the remnants of their failed ritual, she cast one last glance over her shoulder. Kael was already walking toward his herb garden, Sparky trotting at his heels, the dragon's scales shimmering with an inner light that seemed to drink the morning sun. The scene was peaceful, idyllic even. But Lyra knew better. She had seen the abyss lurking behind that calm facade. Back at the Royal College, late into the night, Lyra pored over ancient tomes in the restricted section of the library. Dust motes danced in the lamplight as she flipped through crumbling pages, her fingers tracing lines of text written in infernal script. And there it was, in a chronicle of the Demon Lord's inner circle, a passage describing his right hand. Kael the Undying, master of strategies that broke kingdoms, wielder of arts lost to time. His retirement, if such a thing were possible, would be a mystery wrapped in silence. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the discovery settling over her. The man on the farm was not just a retired soldier, he was a living relic of an age of blood and fire. And he had somehow tamed the world-ender dragon, turning the apocalypse into a pet. The implications were staggering. If he could be reasoned with, perhaps he could be an ally. If not. Lyra closed the book, her mind already formulating a new plan. She would need to dig deeper, to understand Kael's past, his motives. And she would need to approach him not as a threat, but as a puzzle to be solved. For now, the rituals had failed. But knowledge was a weapon too, and she intended to sharpen it. Outside, the moon rose over the farm, casting long shadows across the quiet land. Kael sat on his porch, Sparky curled at his feet, its breathing slow and even. He stared into the darkness beyond his gate, where the echoes of Lyra's magic still lingered like a faint perfume. "They'll be back," he said softly, more to himself than to the dragon. "They always come back. But let them. Retirement is about patience, after all." Sparky let out a contented sigh, a tiny wisp of star-like sparkles escaping its nostrils. Kael smiled, and for a moment, the worries of the world felt very far away. The morning after the archmage's failed ritual, Kael stood in his garden, the scent of damp earth and blooming nightshade blossoms filling the air. Sparky lay sprawled at his feet, a tiny obsidian-scaled creature no larger than a medium-sized dog, though Kael had noticed the pup had grown nearly double in size since he'd rescued it from the trap. The dragon, still blissfully unaware of its own nature, chewed contentedly on what had once been an enchanted trowel, now reduced to twisted metal by those surprisingly sharp teeth. Kael knelt, running a hand through the rich soil. The Aegis hummed beneath his fingertips, that familiar conceptual level protection that made this patch of land feel like the only sane place in a world perpetually on the brink of madness. He'd built this farmstead with his own hands after centuries of service, each stone laid with the deliberate care of someone who had seen too many things destroyed. The main cottage stood behind him, smoke curling from its chimney where a pot of chamomile tea steeped. Beyond the white picket fence, a purely decorative touch, the wilderness stretched toward distant mountains. No more blood, Kael murmured to himself, a mantra he'd repeated daily since retiring. No more conquests. Just tea and quiet. Sparky looked up, its eyes glowing with faint amber light that seemed to swallow the morning sun rather than reflect it. It whined softly, nudging Kael's hand with a snout that felt oddly cool to the touch, like polished stone left in shade. "Hungry again?" Kael chuckled, reaching into his pocket. He produced a small, crystalline shard, a leftover fragment from one of the archmage's failed ritual components that had somehow ended up inside the Aegis's boundary. Sparky's eyes brightened, and it snapped up the shard with a crunch that echoed with subtle spatial distortion. The air around the dragon shimmered briefly, like heat haze over desert sands. Kael frowned. He'd noticed these oddities, the way Sparky's mere presence seemed to bend light, the unnatural growth rate, the appetite for anything magical. But the Aegis pacified all hostile forces within its domain, and Sparky showed nothing but affectionate, puppy-like behavior. Perhaps it was just a rare magical beast, nothing more. The alternative, that he'd accidentally adopted a creature of prophecy, was too absurd to entertain seriously. He was about to return to weeding when the air at the edge of his property thickened. The Aegis didn't react with violence, it never did, but Kael felt its subtle shift, like a door being gently closed against an unwelcome draft. 3 figures materialized just beyond the gate, their forms coalescing from shadows that shouldn't have existed in full daylight. Kael straightened slowly, wiping soil from his hands onto his trousers. He recognized them immediately, even after decades apart. Demonic energy, carefully contained but unmistakable, rolled off them in waves that made the nearby wildflowers wilt. At the forefront stood Gorith, a hulking demon with crimson skin and horns that curved like scimitars. He wore practical leather armor instead of the ornate plate Kael remembered from their campaigns together. Behind him were 2 others, Vex, a lithe shadowwalker with too many eyes, and Grand, a brute whose muscles seemed to strain against reality itself. They were Kael's former comrades, soldiers who had fought beside him when he was the right hand of the Demon Lord. For a moment, no one moved. Goratha's expression shifted from battle-ready intensity to stunned disbelief as he took in the scene, Kael in simple farming clothes, dirt under his nails, standing in a garden that radiated impossible peace. And at his feet, the world-ender dragon, chewing on a metal scrap with the enthusiasm of a mundane pet. Kael. Goratha's voice was a gravelly rumble, deeper than Kael remembered. By the abyss, it really is you. Kael offered a small, weary smile. Gorath. You've aged. You haven't, Gorath said, his eyes narrowing. But then, you never did. He gestured vaguely at the farm. What is this? Some kind of elaborate trap. A illusion to lure us in. It's retirement, Kael said simply. He walked toward the gate, Sparky trotting at his heels. The dragon paused to sniff at a particularly interesting weed, its tail wagging in a way that made the air behind it fracture into prismatic fragments for a split second. Goratha's gaze locked onto Sparky. All three demons tensed, hands drifting toward weapons. That's it, Gorath breathed. The world ender. The prophecy texts described the scales, the eye glow. Kael, step away from it. Now. Kael stopped at the gate, leaning casually against the post. His name is Sparky. And he's under my protection. The words hung in the air, weighted by the Aegis's passive authority. Gorath flinched, as if physically struck by the concept. Protection? Kael, do you have any idea what that thing is? It's not a pet, it's a cataclysm given form. The demon lord has sensed its awakening. He wants it reclaimed for the army. The demon lord, Kael said, his voice losing its warmth, can want many things. I am no longer his right hand. My loyalties are here now. He gestured to the garden, the cottage, Sparky who had rolled onto its back, exposing a belly of shimmering obsidian scales. Vex, the Shadow Walker, hissed. He's gone soft, Gorath. The centuries have rotted his mind. Quiet, Gorath snapped, but his eyes never left Kael. Listen, old friend. I'm not here as an enemy. I'm here to warn you. The Lord is displeased. You left without word, vanished for decades, and now you're harboring the one creature that could unmake his plans. He's given me orders to bring you both back. Willingly, if possible. Kael's expression didn't change, but inside, a cold knot formed in his stomach. He'd hoped his retirement would be forgotten, that the demon lord's endless wars would consume his attention. Apparently not. And if I refuse? Goratha's massive shoulders slumped slightly. Then I'm to take the dragon by force. And you, if you interfere. Sparky, sensing the tension, stood up and padded to Kael's side. It pressed against his leg, a low rumble building in its throat, not a growl, but a sound like distant tectonic plates shifting. The ground beneath their feet vibrated faintly. Look at it, Kael said softly. Does this look like a world-ending threat to you? Grond, the brute, shifted uneasily. It's deceiving you, Kael. The prophecies say it will appear harmless until the moment it unravels reality. Prophecies, Kael scoffed. I've lived through enough prophecies to know they're more suggestion than certainty. He knelt, scratching Sparky behind what passed for ears. The dragon's rumbling ceased, replaced by a contented purr that made the air hum in harmony. Sparky is under the Aegis of the last stand. No hostile force can touch him here. That includes demonic armies. Goratha's eyes widened. The Aegis? You activated that old cheat. I thought it was just legend. It's very real, Kael said, standing again. And it makes this land inviolable. Your weapons, your magic, your curses, they'll fizzle at the gate, just like the royal knights and the archmages before you. A tense silence fell. Gorath studied the boundary, his demonic senses probing the Aegis. Kael watched him, remembering their shared history, the siege of Celestial Peak, the campaign through the Ashen Wastes, the countless battles where Gorath had guarded his flank. This wasn't an enemy, this was a friend caught between loyalty to a master and loyalty to a comrade. Gorath, Kael said, his voice gentler. You know me. You know I've had enough of war. I served for centuries, and all it brought was more blood, more destruction. I want peace. Just, peace. For a long moment, Gorath didn't respond. Then he sighed, a sound like stones grinding. I know, Kael. I remember how you looked after the fall of Lyr. Like something inside you had broken. He glanced at Sparky, who was now chasing a butterfly with playful leaps that left afterimages in the air. But this isn't just about you. The dragon's power, if the demon lord controls it, he could end all conflicts. Unify the realms under one rule. No more war. Or he could become the ultimate tyrant, Kael countered. Power like that corrupts absolutely. You've seen it happen. Vex stepped forward, her multiple eyes blinking in unnerving sequence. We have our orders, Gorith. We must attempt retrieval. Gorith nodded reluctantly. Kael, step aside. Please. Kael didn't move. I can't do that. Gorith raised a hand, and demonic energy coalesced around his fist, a binding spell, designed to immobilize without harm. He hurled it toward Sparky. The spell crossed the gate, and dissolved into harmless motes of light that scattered like dust in the wind. The Aegis hadn't even reacted visibly, it simply negated the hostility as if it had never existed. Grond roared, charging the gate with a massive axe materializing in his hands. He swung at the boundary, but the axe passed through as if through empty air, losing all momentum and force. He stumbled, off balance, and nearly fell. It's useless, Gorith said, his voice heavy with resignation. The Aegis is conceptual. You can't force your way through. Kael watched them, his heart aching. He didn't want to fight his old friends. Gorith, take a message to the demon lord. Tell him I'm retired. Tell him Sparky is no threat, not here, under the Aegis. Tell him to leave us in peace. He won't listen, Gorith said. You know how he is. Once he wants something, he doesn't stop until he has it. He looked at Sparky, who had grown bored of the butterfly and was now nudging a dragonbone toy, a carved femur from some long-extinct beast, with its nose. But I'll deliver the message. For old time's sake. He turned to leave, but paused, looking back at Kael. This isn't over, old friend. The demon lord will send others. Worse than us. Malachor has been ambitious since you left. He's gathering a faction, whispering that you've betrayed the cause. He'll come, and he won't ask nicely. Malachor. Kael's former lieutenant, brilliant, ruthless, and perpetually jealous of Kael's position. The name stirred old memories, none of them pleasant. Let him come, Kael said, but the words felt hollow. Gorith nodded once, a gesture of respect. Then he and his companions dissolved back into shadows, leaving only a faint scent of sulfur and regret. Kael stood at the gate for a long time after they'd gone. The sun climbed higher, warming his shoulders, but a chill had settled in his bones. Retirement, it seemed, was going to be more complicated than he'd hoped. Sparky whined, pawing at his leg. Kael looked down, forcing a smile. It's all right, boy. Just some old friends with bad timing. He picked up the dragonbone toy, a gift from Alara on her last visit, and tossed it across the garden. Sparky bounded after it, movements fluid and impossibly fast. It snatched the toy mid-air, then trotted back proudly, dropping it at Kael's feet. Good fetch, Kael murmured, scratching the dragon's head. Sparky wriggled with pleasure, then sneezed. It was a small sneeze, accompanied by a puff of sparks that looked like miniature stars winking out. But the dragonbone toy, lying between them, suddenly ignited with black flame that consumed it utterly in less than a second, leaving only a fine ash that drifted away on the breeze. Kael stared at the empty spot where the toy had been. Sparky looked up at him, eyes wide and innocent, as if to say, was that me? The air around them seemed to grow heavier, charged with unspoken implications. Kael knelt, meeting Sparky's gaze. The dragon's eyes held galaxies within them, swirling depths of power that the Aegis had pacified but not erased. Well, Kael said softly, more to himself than to the dragon. That's new. He stood, brushing ash from his knees. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a natural storm, perhaps, or something else. The peaceful morning felt fragile now, like glass under pressure. Come on, Sparky, Kael said, turning toward the cottage. Let's get that tea before it oversteeps. The dragon followed, its scales catching the light in ways that shouldn't have been possible, each step leaving faint, shimmering footprints that faded almost instantly. Kael didn't look back at the gate, but he felt the weight of Goritha's warning settling around him like armor he'd hoped never to wear again. Worse was coming. And for the first time since he'd retired, Kael wondered if his quiet life was already slipping through his fingers, one accidental incineration at a time. The morning after Goritha's departure settled over the farm with a deceptive calm. Kael stood at the edge of his vegetable patch, a trowel in hand, but his eyes were fixed on the distant horizon where the demonic envoy had vanished. The soil beneath his fingers felt alien, too soft, too yielding. For centuries, his hands had known only the cold grip of weaponry or the crackle of destructive magic. Now, they fumbled with seeds and weeds, and the dissonance was a quiet ache in his bones. Sparky lay nearby, a small obsidian-scaled bundle curled in a patch of sunlight. The dragon, though Kael still stubbornly thought of him as a puppy, was gnawing contentedly on what remained of the enchanted hoe handle from yesterday's gardening mishap. Tiny fractures of light danced along the wood where Sparky's teeth met the lingering enchantment, and the air around him shimmered almost imperceptibly, like heat haze on a summer road. Kael watched as a ladybug, meandering through the air on delicate wings, suddenly veered off its path, tracing a gentle arc around Sparky before continuing on. Space itself bent around the creature, accommodating his presence without protest. Centuries, Kael thought, the word heavy in his mind. He closed his eyes, and the present farmstead melted away. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a blade. He stood on the ashen plains of Karvoth, the sky choked with smoke and the screams of dying legions. The air tasted of ozone and blood. Kael, clad in the black and crimson armor of the demon lord's right hand, raised a hand, and a wave of necrotic energy rippled outward, withering an entire battalion of celestial knights where they stood. Their armor turned to dust mid-stride, their bodies crumbling like ancient parchment. There was no glory in it, only a hollow, mechanical efficiency. Beside him, Gorith bellowed a laugh, his axe slick with gore. Another victory for the abyss, brother. Asterisk. But Kael felt nothing. Or rather, he felt too much, all of it compressed into a leaden weight behind his sternum. He looked at his hands, gloved in leather and etched with runes of power, and wondered when they had stopped feeling like his own. The war had stretched for lifetimes, mortal kingdoms rose and fell like tides, and he remained, an immutable instrument of destruction. The demon lord's commands were absolute, the purpose clear: conquer, subjugate, expand the realm of shadow. Yet, with each century, the purpose felt more like a cage. He remembered the faces of those he'd slain, not as enemies, but as people with families, dreams, fears. Their ghosts lingered in the quiet moments, which grew fewer and farther between. One night, after raising the library city of Lyrander, he'd walked among the smoldering ruins. A single, half-charred book lay open at his feet, its pages illuminated with delicate paintings of constellations and botanical sketches. He'd picked it up, the parchment crumbling at his touch, and felt a pang of something so profound it stole his breath. It was grief, yes, but also a yearning for something he couldn't name, for creation instead of destruction, for growth instead of decay. That was the moment the seed of retirement took root. It would take another 100 years of careful planning, of hoarding artifacts and knowledge, before he could enact his escape, but the decision was made there, in the ashes of a civilization he'd helped erase. Kael opened his eyes, blinking against the gentle sunlight of his farm. The contrast was so stark it felt like physical whiplash. Here, the only sounds were the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of mundane birds, and Sparky's contented grumbling as he chewed. The dragon had finished the hoe handle and was now nosing at Kael's boot, his whip-like tail wagging hopefully. Kael sighed, a soft exhalation that carried the weight of remembered centuries, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, dull crystal, a spent mana stone from an old focus he'd dismantled weeks ago. He tossed it to Sparky. Sparky pounced with a playful yip, catching the crystal mid-air. As his jaws closed around it, the stone didn't just crack, it dissolved into a fine, glittering powder that Sparky lapped up with a pleased rumble. A faint, kaleidoscopic glow emanated from his throat for a second before fading. Kael frowned, kneeling beside him. "You really do have a taste for the magical, don't you, boy?" he murmured, running a hand over Sparky's head. The scales were warm, almost humming with contained energy. Under his touch, the subtle warping of space intensified briefly, bending the light around Sparky's form into a faint halo before settling. Not just hunger, Kael thought. Assimilation. He's consuming the inherent magic, integrating it. What does that make him? He pushed the thought aside. For now, Sparky was his. That was enough. The morning wore on in quiet routine. Kael weeded the carrot patch, repaired a section of fence where a curious deer had tried to intrude, the Aegis had gently repelled it, leaving the creature confused but unharmed, and brewed a pot of jasmine tea. He sat on the porch steps, Sparky curled at his feet, and watched the cloud shadows drift across his fields. The peace was a tangible thing, a balm on old wounds. He sipped his tea, savoring the floral notes, and allowed himself a moment of unguarded contentment. This was what he'd fought for, not for dominion, but for this silence, this simplicity. His reverie was broken by the familiar crunch of wheels on the gravel path leading to his gate. Ilara's wagon, drawn by a sturdy draft horse, came into view. She waved, her smile bright against the green of the surrounding forest. Sparky perked up, trotting to the gate with an eager whine. "Good morning, Kael," Ilara called as she brought the wagon to a halt. She hopped down, her movements practical and sure. She wore a simple linen dress stained with earth and herb resin, and a basket hung from her arm. "I come bearing gifts. Found a patch of silver root and dreamers bloom deep in the whisperwood. Thought they might thrive in that shaded corner you've been nursing." Kael stood, returning her smile. "Ilara. You're always a welcome sight. Come in, the kettle's still warm." He opened the gate, a simple wooden thing that swung without a lock, an implicit trust in the Aegis's protection. Ilara stepped through, and as always, she paused for a half-second, a faint shiver running through her. "It never gets less strange," she said, her voice low. "The air here, it's so still. So peaceful. It's like stepping into another world." "That's the idea," Kael said lightly, leading her to the porch. Sparky danced around Ilara's legs, sniffing at her basket. She laughed, scratching him behind the ear horns. "And how's this little menace today?" "Hungry, as usual," Kael said, pouring her a cup of tea. "He just ate a mana crystal." Ilara's hand stilled on Sparky's head. She looked from the dragon to Kael, her green eyes sharpening with herbalist's curiosity. "A mana crystal? As in, he consumed it? Dissolved it to dust and absorbed it, yes. That's not normal puppy behavior, Kael." "I never said he was normal." Kael's tone was easy, but he watched her closely. Ilara was no fool. She had a deep, intuitive understanding of natural and magical forces, honed by years of gathering herbs in enchanted woods. Her suspicion was a slow-burning thing, but it was there. She accepted the tea, taking a thoughtful sip. "No, you didn't." She sat on the step beside him, setting her basket down. Sparky immediately tried to stick his nose in it, and she gently nudged him away. "These visits of mine. I've seen things. The knights who came, their spells dying at your border. The mages with their failed rituals. And now, demonic visitors. Your farm is a quiet place, Kael, but it sits at the center of a very loud storm." Kael was silent for a long moment, gazing out over his land. The truth perched on his tongue, heavy and dangerous. But Ilara had shown him nothing but kindness. She'd asked no probing questions, demanded no explanations. She'd simply accepted his reclusive existence and offered friendship in the form of herbs and conversation. He owed her something. "The storm isn't of my making," he said finally, his voice quiet. "Not this one. I retired here to get away from storms. From wars that have lasted longer than most kingdoms. I served a powerful master for a very long time. Did things that," he trailed off, the memories of Karvoth and Lyrander flashing behind his eyes. "Things that weigh on the soul. This farm, this peace, it's my atonement. Or my escape. Perhaps both." Ilara listened, her expression softening from suspicion to something like compassion. "And the protection? The way nothing hostile can touch this place. A legacy of my previous employment. A final boon, you could say. It keeps me safe. It keeps Sparky safe." He reached down, his hand resting on the dragon's back. Sparky leaned into the touch, emitting a low, purring rumble that vibrated through the wood of the porch. "And Sparky?" Ilara asked gently. "What is he, really? He's not a dog. I've handled enough magical creatures to know that much. The way the light bends around him, the hunger for enchanted items, and he's grown twice in size since I first met him, Kael. In weeks." Kael met her gaze. He saw no fear there, only a keen, intelligent concern. "I don't know everything," he admitted, which was true. "I found him trapped, hurt. He was small and scared. I couldn't leave him. Whatever he is, here, under this protection, he's harmless. Docile. He's my responsibility now." Ilara nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She didn't press further. Instead, she said, "You're a good man, Kael. Whatever your past, you're tending a garden now, not a battlefield. That counts for something." She smiled, a genuine, warm expression. "And he's lucky to have you." Even if he does eat all your tools. The tension broke. Kael chuckled, the sound rusty but real. He's a trial, that's for certain. Come, let me show you where I was thinking of planting those dreamer's blooms. They spent the next hour in the garden, discussing soil composition and sunlight. Ilara's knowledge was extensive, and Kael found himself genuinely enjoying the exchange. It was a normal conversation, about normal things, and the sheer novelty of it was a gift. For a while, the shadows of his past receded, held at bay by the simple act of planting flowers. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the farm, Ilara prepared to leave. I should get back before dark, she said, loading her empty basket into the wagon. The whisperwood gets attentive at night. Thank you for the herbs and the company, Kael said, walking her to the gate. Any time. She paused, her hand on the wagon's side. Kael, be careful. The attention you're drawing, it won't stop. And if they can't get through your defenses, she glanced meaningfully at Sparky, who was sitting obediently by Kael's heel, watching her with luminous eyes. They might look for other ways. Softer targets. A chill, unrelated to the evening breeze, traced Kael's spine. He understood her implication. His attachments, his friendship with her, his care for Sparky, were vulnerabilities outside the Aegis. I'll be vigilant, he promised, his voice grave. She nodded, gave Sparky a final pat, and climbed onto the wagon seat. With a click of her tongue, the horse started forward, and she disappeared down the forest path. Kael stood at the gate long after she was gone, Sparky quiet beside him. The farm was silent again, but the peace felt fragile now, threaded through with new tension. Ilara's warning echoed in his mind. Softer targets. He turned to go back inside, his senses, dulled by years of retirement, stretching outward instinctively. That was when he saw it, a flicker of movement in the deep shadows of the ancient oaks at the forest's edge, far beyond his property line. It was there and gone in an instant, but Kael's eyes, honed by millennia of warfare, caught the silhouette, tall, armored and sleek, dark plate that drank the light, crowned with a familiar, jagged horned helmet. Malachar. His former lieutenant. Ambitious, cunning, and bitterly resentful of Kael's former status and his current defiance. Goreth had warned of him. And now he was here, watching. Kael didn't move, didn't react outwardly. But inside, the retired general stirred, a predator recognizing another. Malachar wasn't here to attack the farm directly. He'd seen the fate of those who tried. No, he was scouting. Assessing. Learning. Kael's gaze dropped to Sparky, who was now chewing on a stick, utterly oblivious. Then he looked toward the path Ilara had taken, now swallowed by gathering twilight. A cold certainty settled in his gut. Malachar wasn't just watching the farm. He was watching them. Kael, Sparky, Ilara. He was mapping the connections, the routines, the points of contact outside the inviolable border. He's looking for a lever, Kael thought, his hands curling into fists at his sides. And he thinks he's found one. The cozy retirement, the peaceful farm, the simple life with his strange pet, it had all just become a chessboard, and Malachar had made the first move from the shadows. Kael took a deep breath, the scent of turned earth and jasmine tea filling his lungs. He would not let this stand. He had left the wars behind, but he would defend this new peace with every ounce of his retired, yet far from extinct, power. Come on, Sparky, he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Time to go inside. We have preparations to make. He turned and walked back to the cottage, Sparky trotting at his heels. But his eyes, hard and calculating, scanned the tree line one last time. The game was on. And Kael, the immortal former right hand, was no longer just a gardener. He was a protector, and he had just identified his next threat. In the deepening gloom of the forest, Malachar smiled, a thin, cruel curve of lips unseen in the darkness. He had seen the herbalist leave. He had seen the easy camaraderie, the clear attachment. The farm was impenetrable, but the world outside was not. And every attachment was a chain waiting to be pulled. He melted back into the shadows, his plan already taking shape. The dragon would be theirs, and Kael's defiance would be broken, not by force, but by the very connections he had foolishly allowed to grow in his retirement. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills surrounding Kael's farm like a silver shroud, dampening the world into muted shades of green and gray. Kael stood on his porch, a steaming mug of chamomile tea cradled in his hands, watching the sun struggle to pierce the haze. Beside him, Sparky lay sprawled on the weathered wooden planks, belly up, tiny obsidian scales catching what little light there was. The dragon, still puppy-sized, though now the length of Kael's forearm, snored softly, a wisp of smoke curling from its nostrils with each exhale. Kael sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through him like a gentle spell. Centuries of battlefield mornings, crisp with the scent of blood and ozone, loud with the clang of armor, had left him with a deep appreciation for this quiet. The Aegis of the last stand hummed at the edge of his awareness, a constant, soothing presence that made the very air within his boundaries feel thicker, safer. It was more than a barrier, it was a promise. Nothing hostile could touch this place. Not blades, not magic, not even ill intent. But last night's sighting of Malachor in the tree line had stirred old instincts. Kael's fingers tightened around the mug. Malachor. His former lieutenant, all ambition and sharp edges, who'd always viewed Kael's loyalty to the demon lord as a ladder to climb. Kael had retired to escape such politics, but it seemed retirement was just another kind of battlefield, one with flower beds and a pet that might unwittingly end the world. Sparky stirred, rolling onto its feet with a yawn that revealed a flash of pearlescent teeth. It padded over and nudged Kael's leg, its eyes, usually a warm, molten gold, glinting with a hint of something deeper, like stars glimpsed through a rift. Kael scratched behind its ear ridges, feeling the strange, cool smoothness of the scales. Hungry again, he murmured. Sparky had devoured 2 enchanted gardening trowels and a minor ward stone just yesterday, leaving only faintly glowing dust. Its appetite for magic was growing, and with it, Kael's suspicion. Puppies didn't consume enchantments. But then, puppies didn't occasionally cause the air to shimmer like heat haze on a summer day, either. He was about to head inside for breakfast when a flicker at the edge of the property caught his eye. Beyond the white-painted gate that marked the Aegis's boundary, the mist seemed to coalesce into shapes. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the gray, a suggestion of movement. Then, a soft, plaintive whine echoed across the field. It sounded exactly like Sparky's distress cry from the day Kael had found him in that trap. Sparky's head snapped up, ears pricked. It let out a curious chirp and trotted to the edge of the porch, peering into the mist. Kael didn't move. His senses, honed over lifetimes of war, parsed the sound. Too perfect. Too timed. And layered beneath it, a faint, oily signature of illusion magic, crude, by his standards, but competent enough to fool most. Malachor's work. Of course. Lure the dragon out with a copy of itself, then snatch it once it crossed the boundary. A simple plan, born of desperation and a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Aegis did. He sighed, setting his mug on the porch railing. Stay, he told Sparky, his voice calm. The dragon glanced back at him, tilting its head, but obeyed, settling onto its haunches with a soft thump. Kael stepped off the porch and walked leisurely toward the gate. The grass was damp under his boots, and the morning air carried the scent of wet earth and blooming lavender from Alara's last gift. As he approached, the illusions grew more elaborate. Now, the mist-formed Sparky appeared trapped again, this time in a glowing net of magical energy that sparked and sizzled just beyond the gate. It whined louder, pitifully, and thrashed. Behind it, shadowy figures moved in the trees, Malachor's agents, no doubt, waiting to pounce. Kael stopped a few feet from the gate, crossing his arms. He could feel the Aegis here, a gentle pressure against his skin, like standing in the still eye of a hurricane. He raised his voice, conversational. Malachor. I know it's you. The projection's a bit stiff in the hindquarters. Real Sparky has more flair when he's pretending to be distressed. For a moment, nothing. Then the illusionary Sparky flickered, and Malachor's voice, tight with frustration, emanated from the mist itself. Kael. Still playing farmer, I see. Hand over the beast. This doesn't have to be messy. It's not a beast, Kael said, his tone mild. It's my dog. And I don't hand over my dog to people who use cheap parlor tricks. He knelt, picking up a small, smooth stone from the path. He infused it with a whisper of his own power, not much, just enough to disrupt unstable magic. Centuries ago, he'd shattered siege engines with less effort. He tossed the stone underhand through the gate. It passed the boundary without resistance. The moment it crossed, the illusion shattered. The fake Sparky dissolved into wisps of mist. The net vanished with a sound like tearing silk. In the trees, 3 figures clad in dark, non-reflective leather stumbled into view, blinking as their spell collapsed. They were young demons, by the look of them, lesser imps with sharp features and nervous eyes. Malaker's new recruits, eager to prove themselves. Kael stood. Go home, boys. Tell Malaker his illusions need work. And maybe invest in a better teacher. One of the imps, bolder than the others, snarled and raised a hand. Dark energy crackled around his fingers, a minor hex meant to induce paralysis. He hurled it at Kael. The spell hit the Aegis's boundary and dissipated like smoke against glass. Not even a ripple. The imp stared, dumbfounded. Sparky, who had been watching with keen interest, chose that moment to trot up beside Kael. It sat, tail wagging slowly, and let out a playful growl. To Kael, it sounded like the rumble of a contented cat. To the imps, it must have been something else entirely. Because as Sparky growled, the air around it shimmered visibly, and for a split second, the dragon's shadow stretched long and twisted, hinting at wings and a serpentine neck of impossible scale. A wave of primal fear, cold and deep, washed over the clearing. The imps froze, their bravado evaporating. The bold one took a step back, tripping over a root. They didn't wait for orders. With panicked glances at Sparky, who now yawned and licked a paw, they turned and fled into the forest, crashing through underbrush. Kael looked down at Sparky. The dragon looked up, eyes innocent. Show off, Kael said, but he couldn't help a small smile. He knelt, ruffling the scales on Sparky's head. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Sparky chirped, nudging his hand for more pets. The fear aura had vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the peaceful hum of the farm. From deeper in the woods, Kael felt a surge of anger and frustration, Malaker's signature, familiar as an old scar. He was out there, watching his plan fail. Kael straightened, facing the trees. I know you can hear me, Malaker, he called, his voice carrying easily in the quiet morning. The Aegis isn't just a wall. It's a concept. Nothing hostile enters. That includes your schemes. Leave us alone. There was no verbal reply, but the anger spiked, then receded, fading as Malaker withdrew. Kael didn't need to see him to know the expression on his face, tight lips, burning eyes, mind already whirring with new calculations. Malaker wasn't one to give up. He'd just pivot. Kael turned back to the farmhouse, Sparky at his heels. The encounter had been minor, almost laughable. But it confirmed his fears. Malaker was probing, testing the Aegis's limits. And he'd seen Sparky's reaction. He'd seen the fear it could invoke, even accidentally. That knowledge was dangerous. Inside, Kael prepared breakfast, scrambled eggs from his chickens, toasted bread, a slice of cheese. Sparky curled by the hearth, gnawing on an old, depleted mana crystal Kael had given it as a toy. The dragon's contentment was palpable, a warm counterpoint to Kael's simmering unease. He ate slowly, thinking. The Aegis protected the land and anyone under his protection within it. Ilara, when she visited, was covered. But she lived in the village, a half-hour's walk through the woods. Outside the boundary, she was vulnerable. She'd warned him of this herself. Malaker was ruthless and clever. If he couldn't get to Sparky directly, he'd go for the next best thing, the person Kael had allowed close. The person whose absence would draw Kael out. Kael's grip tightened on his fork. The eggs tasted like ash. He set it down, staring into the fire. Centuries of command had taught him to anticipate enemy moves. Malaker's next step was obvious. He'd target Ilara. Not to harm her necessarily, but to use her as leverage. A hostage to force Kael's hand, to make him lower the Aegis or surrender Sparky. Sparky made a soft noise, dropping the crystal and padding over. It rested its head on Kael's knee, gazing up with those deep, star-flecked eyes. As if sensing his distress, it emitted a low, soothing hum that vibrated through Kael's bones. The air in the kitchen grew stiller, calmer. For a moment, the weight lifted. Kael stroked its head. You're too powerful for your own good, you know that, he whispered. And I'm too attached for mine. He made a decision. He wouldn't wait for Malaker to act. He'd need to warn Ilara, to ensure she was careful. Maybe even suggest she stay at the farm for a while. But that would mean involving her more deeply in his dangerous world, something he'd hoped to avoid. His retirement was supposed to be solitary, simple. Now it was entwined with a world-ending dragon and a herbalist with kind eyes. He spent the afternoon in the garden, weeding and pruning, the physical work grounding him. Sparky chased butterflies, its movements a blur of obsidian and occasional spatial warps that made the insects zig when they should have zagged. Every so often, Kael would pause, scanning the tree line. He saw nothing, but he felt watched. Not Malachar, he was gone for now, but his spies. They'd be reporting every move. As dusk painted the sky in shades of violet and orange, Kael went to the gate. He placed a hand on the post, feeling the Aegis thrum under his palm. Keep him safe, he murmured to the land itself. Then he whistled for Sparky, and they headed inside for the night. He didn't sleep well. Dreams of past battles merged with visions of Alara, trapped and afraid. He woke before dawn, the house silent except for Sparky's rhythmic breathing from the foot of the bed. At first light, he was on the porch again. This time, he saw movement in the distance, not illusions, but real figures slipping through the trees at the forest's edge, heading away from the farm. Toward the village. There were two of them, moving with the practiced stealth of scouts. They carried no weapons he could see, but their intent was clear in their posture, observation, tracking. Malachar's spies. Following the path Alara took home. Kael's blood went cold. It was starting. The covert attack had failed, so now Malachar was gathering intelligence, learning her routines, her vulnerabilities. The next phase would be a strike. Soon. Sparky nudged his hand, whining softly. Kael looked down. The dragon's eyes were fixed on the retreating spies, its body tense. It understood, on some instinctual level, that these were threats. To Kael, to their peace. I know, Kael said, his voice low. We'll handle it. But inside, a old, familiar resolve hardened. The same resolve that had once held demonic lines against celestial armies. Retirement hadn't erased it, it had just given it a new purpose. He watched until the spies disappeared into the gloom of the forest. The morning mist was burning off, revealing a clear blue sky. A beautiful day. But the peace felt fragile now, like glass under tension. Malachar had chosen his new strategy. And Kael would need to choose his response. For now, he turned and went inside to brew another pot of tea. There were plans to make, warnings to deliver. And a dragon to keep from accidentally terrifying the entire countryside. As he filled the kettle, Sparky curled around his ankles, a warm, solid presence. Kael allowed himself a moment of grim humor. Who would have thought? The demon lord's right hand, retired, making tea while an apocalypse dragon purred at his feet, and the real threat was a former lieutenant with a grudge and a bad habit of targeting innocent herbalists. Retirement, it seemed, was anything but quiet. The morning dawned with a crispness that spoke of autumn's deepening hold on the valley. Mist clung to the treetops like ghostly lace, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Kael stood on the porch of his farmhouse, a steaming cup of jasmine tea in hand, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in hues of gold and rose. Beside him, Sparky lay curled on a woven mat, obsidian scales catching the light with a subtle iridescence. The dragon, still puppy-sized in Kael's mind, though it had grown to the length of a large dog, snuffled in its sleep, tiny puffs of smoke escaping its nostrils. Kael took a slow sip, savoring the tranquility. Retirement, he reflected, was a delicate thing. Centuries of war had honed him into a weapon, the right hand of the demon lord, a title that once made kingdoms tremble. Now, he was a farmer with a strange pet and an inviolable plot of land. The Aegis of the Last Stand hummed softly in the background of his awareness, a conceptual shield that made his home a fortress no force could breach. It was his ultimate cheat, his reward for surviving the endless conflicts. And yet, peace required maintenance. He glanced at the empty spot by the herb garden where Alara usually appeared around this time. The local herbalist had become a regular visitor over the past weeks, drawn by the farm's unnatural calm and Kael's cryptic stories. She brought rare plants, shared tea, and asked careful questions about Sparky's odd behaviors, like how the creature had recently devoured an enchanted trowel with gusto. Kael enjoyed her company, she was a slice of normalcy in his otherwise extraordinary retirement. But today, the spot remained vacant. Late, Kael murmured to himself, setting the cup on the porch railing. Alara was punctual to a fault, her visits as reliable as the sunrise. A faint unease prickled at the back of his neck, the old instinct stirring. He pushed them down. Perhaps she was busy with a new batch of remedies or had overslept. Retirement meant not jumping at shadows. He spent the morning tending the garden, pulling weeds from between rows of luminescent moonblooms and whispering vines. Sparky trailed after him, batting at butterflies with clumsy paws, its tail wagging in a way that still reminded Kael of a puppy. But there were signs, subtle, unsettling signs. When Sparky yawned, the air around it shimmered faintly, as if reality itself were stretching. When it chewed on a stick, the wood didn't just splinter, it dissolved into motes of light. Kael noted these things with a detached curiosity. He'd suspected Sparky was more than a lost animal since the day he'd found it whimpering in that trap, its obsidian scales too intricate, its eyes too ancient. But the Aegis pacified whatever destructive impulses it might have had, turning potential apocalypse into affectionate nuzzles. By midday, Elara still hadn't arrived. Kael's unease grew into a quiet tension. He walked to the edge of his property, where the Aegis's boundary shimmered like a heat haze. Beyond lay the forest, a tapestry of oak and pine that sloped toward the distant village. No sign of movement, no cheerful call of greeting. He closed his eyes, extending his senses, a skill honed in battlefields now repurposed for pastoral life. The forest whispered with the usual sounds, birdsong, rustling leaves, the distant chatter of a stream. But there, beneath it all, a discordant note. The faint, lingering taint of dark magic, like oil on water. "Sparky," Kael said, his voice low. The dragon perked up, trotting to his side. "Stay here." He stepped beyond the gate. For the first time since activating the Aegis, Kael left the protection of his land. The difference was immediate. The air felt thinner, charged with potential danger. The Aegis's hum faded to a distant echo, and the familiar weight of vulnerability settled on his shoulders. It was an odd sensation, like shedding armor he'd grown accustomed to. He took a deep breath, the forest sense sharper now, edged with pine resin and decay. He followed the path Elara usually took, a narrow trail worn into the forest floor by deer and foragers. His movements were silent, a ghost among the trees. Years of stealth had not abandoned him, even in retirement. He scanned the ground, eyes missing nothing. Here, a boot print in the soft earth, Elara's, small and familiar. There, a scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush, the same green wool she often wore. And then, the signs he'd feared. A patch of disturbed leaves, as if someone had struggled. Deep gouges in the soil, the marks of heavy boots. A faint, acrid smell, the residue of a binding spell, crude but effective. Kael knelt, fingers brushing the ground. The magic was demonic in origin, laced with the same oily taint he'd sensed earlier. Malaker's work. His former lieutenant had always been cunning, preferring subterfuge over brute force. The failed illusion attack on the farm had been a test, this was the real move. Kael's jaw tightened. He'd known Malaker would escalate after the last confrontation, but targeting Elara, that was a line crossed. Retirement had softened him, yes, but it hadn't erased the cold calculus of war. Elara was an innocent, a thread in the fragile tapestry of his new life. Pull it, and everything might unravel. He stood, following the trail deeper into the forest. The signs grew clearer, broken branches, scuff marks on tree bark, the occasional drop of blood, not Elara's, from the color, likely from a careless kidnapper. They were heading northeast, toward the jagged hills that bordered the demonic Badlands. Malaker's hidden base, no doubt. Kael moved faster now, a predator on the hunt. The forest blurred around him, his old reflexes reawakening with each step. After an hour, he reached a small clearing where the trail went cold. The kidnappers had covered their tracks here, using a basic obscurement spell. Kael almost smiled. Amateurish. He closed his eyes again, focusing on the residual energies. The spell had a signature, a particular sour note that matched Malaker's arrogance. He traced it to a concealed entrance behind a waterfall, the water cascading over mossy rocks with a roar that masked all sound. He was about to move when a whine cut through the forest silence. Kael turned. Sparky stood at the edge of the clearing, having followed him despite the order. The dragon's scales were duller outside the Aegis, as if the protective field had been polishing them. Its eyes, usually pools of playful curiosity, now glowed with a faint, cosmic light. It whined again, a sound that vibrated in Kael's bones, full of concern and a primal awareness of danger. "I told you to stay," Kael said, but there was no real reproach in his tone. Sparky padded over, nuzzling his hand. The dragon's presence was a comfort, a reminder of why he was doing this. Not for vengeance or old loyalties, but for the simple, profound need to protect what was his. He knelt, meeting Sparky's gaze. "She's in trouble," he said softly. "And it's my fault for drawing them here." Sparky let out a low rumble, not a growl but a promise. The air around it warped slightly, space bending to its will. Even pacified, the world-ender dragon's power was staggering. Kael wondered, not for the first time, what would happen if the Aegis ever failed. But that was a thought for another day. He stood, decision made. He couldn't leave Alara in Malaker's hands. The hidden base was ahead, and he had no idea what defenses lay within. The Aegis wouldn't protect him out here, but he didn't need it. He had centuries of experience, a body honed by immortal resilience, and a will that had faced down gods. Returning to the farm briefly, he went to a locked chest in the corner of his bedroom. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay his old sword. He hadn't touched it since retiring, preferring gardening tools to blades. Unwrapping it now, the metal gleamed dully in the afternoon light. It was a simple weapon, unadorned, but every inch of it was etched with memories, battles fought, lives taken, a world shaped by its edge. He hefted it, the weight familiar and strangely comforting. Back on the porch, he strapped the sword to his back. Sparky watched, whining softly. Kael reached down, scratching the dragon behind the ears, a spot that always made it purr with contentment. "Guard the farm," he said. "I'll be back with her." He took one last look at his home, the tidy garden, the cozy farmhouse, the shimmering boundary of the Aegis. This was what he was fighting for. Not for power or dominion, but for the right to brew tea in peace, to tend his plants, to have a pet that might end the world but preferred belly rubs. His eyes hardened, the retired general surfacing beneath the farmer's calm. Resolve settled in his chest, cold and unyielding. Malaker had made a mistake, thinking Kael's retirement meant weakness. It meant he had something worth defending now. With a final nod to Sparky, Kael turned and strode into the forest, toward the waterfall and whatever lay beyond. The first step beyond the gate was taken, and there would be no turning back. The forest beyond Kael's farm was a different world. For months, the Aegis of the Last Stand had wrapped his land in a cocoon of absolute peace, a silence so profound it felt like living inside a held breath. Now, as he stepped past the invisible boundary marked by an old oak tree, the world rushed back in with startling clarity. The air tasted of damp earth and pine resin, carrying the distant cry of a hawk and the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. The protective hum of the Aegis faded to a faint whisper at the edge of his awareness, like a song heard from another room. Kael paused, one hand resting on the rough bark of the oak. Behind him, Sparky whined softly, pressing against his leg. The tiny dragon, still puppy-sized, though its obsidian scales now shimmered with faint constellations when the light hit them just right, looked up with eyes that held galaxies. Kael knelt, scratching behind Sparky's ear ridges. "Stay close," he murmured. "And no glowing. We're being subtle today." Sparky huffed a puff of warm air that smelled of ozone and cinnamon, then trotted ahead, nose to the ground. Kael followed, his old sword, a simple, unadorned blade he'd named Quieta centuries ago, resting in a worn scabbard at his hip. It felt lighter than he remembered, or perhaps he was heavier with the weight of this new life he stood to lose. The trail was easy to read for someone who'd spent centuries tracking enemies across battlefields and through dimensional rifts. Broken twigs, disturbed moss, the faint imprint of booted feet in soft soil, Malaker's agents had been competent but hurried. They'd dragged Alara northwest, toward the jagged peaks known as the Shattered Teeth. Kael's lips thinned. Malaker had always favored dramatic hideouts. As they moved deeper into the forest, the terrain grew rougher. Gnarled roots snaked across the path, and thick curtains of moss hung from ancient trees. Kael moved with a grace that belied his apparent relaxation, his steps silent, his eyes missing nothing. Retirement had softened the edges of his vigilance, but the core remained, a predator's awareness honed over lifetimes of conflict. How strange, he thought, ducking beneath a low-hanging branch. Centuries ago, I would have sensed the ambush before they even took position. As if summoned by the thought, 3 figures dropped from the trees ahead. They were lesser demons, scaled, horned, with eyes like burning coals. Malaker's favorites for dirty work. The lead demon grinned, revealing needle-sharp teeth. The right hand himself. "We heard you'd gone soft." Kael didn't break stride. "I prefer retired. It has better connotations." Sparky growled, a sound that vibrated with unnatural depth. The air around the dragon wavered slightly, as if reality itself were flinching. "Cute pet," sneered the second demon, hefting a serrated blade. "We'll skin it for a trophy after we're done with you." Kael's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in his chest. He'd heard similar threats 1,000 times before, directed at comrades, at prisoners, at innocent villages caught in the crossfire. Each time, he'd answered with violence. Now, he simply sighed. You're blocking the path. The demons lunged. Kael didn't draw quietus. Instead, he stepped into the attack, his movements fluid and economical. He caught the first demon's wrist, twisted, and heard the bone snap like dry kindling. A sharp kick to the knee sent the creature crumpling with a shriek. The second demon swung its blade, a wild, telegraphed arc that Kael sidestepped before driving his palm into its throat. The demon gagged, dropping its weapon as it clutched at its crushed windpipe. The third demon hesitated, its confidence evaporating. Kael looked at it, and for a moment, the retired farmer vanished. In his place stood the right hand of the demon lord, a being whose gaze had once made battlefields fall silent. The demon stumbled back, tripping over a root. "Tell Malachar I'm coming," Kael said, his voice quiet but carrying. "And that he's made a mistake." The demon scrambled away, disappearing into the foliage. Kael watched it go, then turned to the two remaining. They were groaning, but alive. He considered finishing them, old habits died hard, but instead, he knelt beside the one with the broken wrist. "The herbalist," he said. "Is she unharmed?" The demon spat, a glob of acidic saliva that sizzled against the moss. Kael caught it on a leaf he'd plucked without seeming to move, then dropped it aside. "Answer the question," he said, his tone still calm, but with an edge that made the demon flinch. "She's alive," the demon grunted. "Malachar wants her as leverage, not a corpse." Kael nodded, standing. "Good. Now, I suggest you crawl back to whatever hole you came from. And if I see you again." He didn't finish the threat. He didn't need to. As he continued along the trail, Sparky trotted up beside him, nuzzling his hand. Kael scratched the dragon's head absently, his mind already analyzing the encounter. Too slow. I'm reacting, not anticipating. Retirement has made me complacent. But another part of him, the part that enjoyed brewing tea and watching Sparky chase butterflies, whispered that perhaps complacency wasn't such a terrible thing. Until it endangered those he cared about. The forest gave way to rocky foothills as they climbed toward the shattered teeth. The air grew thinner, colder. Kael's breath misted in the late afternoon light. He paused at a stream to refill his water skin, his eyes scanning the opposite bank. There, a scrap of green fabric caught on a thorn bush. Ilara's cloak. He waded across, the icy water soaking his boots. Sparky splashed through beside him, seemingly unaffected by the cold. When Kael retrieved the fabric, he found it stained with a faint, silvery residue, demon-binding magic. His jaw tightened. Malachar was taking no chances. "We're close," he whispered to Sparky. The dragon's scales shimmered, and for a moment, Kael saw through its eyes, a kaleidoscopic view of magical signatures. The trail glowed like a neon path, dotted with the fading auras of the kidnappers. And ahead, a concentration of dark energy pulsed like a diseased heart. Malachar's base. They moved more cautiously now, sticking to shadows and rock formations. Kael's senses stretched out, picking up the subtle signs of traps, a tripwire woven from shadow stuff, a pressure plate disguised as ordinary stone, a ward that would alert the caster to any passage. Each one, he disarmed with practiced ease, his fingers moving with a precision that spoke of countless similar operations in his past. "This is what I left behind," he thought, carefully unwinding the magical trigger from a snare designed to entangle souls. The constant vigilance. The paranoia. The knowledge that every step could be your last. Yet, as he worked, he realized something had changed. Before, he'd done this for conquest, for duty, for the cold logic of war. Now, he did it for Ilara's smile, for the way she'd laughed when Sparky tried to help her garden by accidentally turning the soil into glass. For the fragile peace he'd built. That realization was more terrifying than any ambush. As dusk began to paint the sky in shades of violet and orange, they reached a narrow pass between two towering spires of rock. According to the magical trail, the base lay just beyond. Kael crouched behind a boulder, peering into the pass. It was a natural choke point, and Malachar had fortified it well. Two demon sentries stood guard, their forms blurred by illusion magic to resemble ordinary shadows. More traps lined the path, he could see the glint of enchanted wire, the faint shimmer of barrier spells. Sparky nudged his leg, then pointed its snout upward. Kael followed the gesture. The rock face to their left was steep but climbable, leading to a ledge that overlooked the pass from above. A risky approach, but it would bypass the defenses. He nodded to Sparky. "Good thinking." The climb was treacherous, the stone slick with moisture. Kael moved with the sure-footedness of someone who'd scaled fortress walls under hails of arrows, his fingers finding holes where none seemed to exist. Sparky simply walked up the vertical surface, its tiny claws gripping the rock with unnatural adhesion. From the ledge, they had a clear view of the pass and the valley beyond. And there it was, Malaker's hidden base. It was built into the side of a mountain, disguised as a natural cave formation. But Kael's eyes, trained to see through deception, picked out the telltale signs: two smooth stone, strategically placed boulders that formed defensive positions, the faint glow of containment wards around the entrance. And in a cage of dark energy near the cave mouth. Ilara. She sat with her back straight, her hands bound with glowing chains. Even from this distance, Kael could see the defiance in her posture. Her cloak was torn, and a bruise darkened her cheek, but she was alive. Unbroken. A figure emerged from the cave, and Kael's breath caught. Malaker. His former lieutenant hadn't changed much in the decades since Kael had last seen him. Tall, lean, with silver hair tied back in a severe knot and eyes the color of tarnished copper. He wore the black and crimson armor of the Demon Lord's elite, though the insignia had been altered, a personal sigil now marked the pauldron. Ambition, it seemed, had finally overridden loyalty. Malaker walked to Ilara's cage, a smug grin spreading across his sharp features. He said something Kael couldn't hear, but Ilara's response was clear: she spat at his feet. Malaker laughed, then turned, his gaze sweeping the valley as if he knew he was being watched. Kael's hand tightened on Quietus's hilt. The old hunger for violence stirred, the part of him that had ended kingdoms and broken armies. But he pushed it down. This wasn't about conquest. It was about retrieval. He studied the layout. The base was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 20 demons total, plus Malaker. The cage was warded, but the wards were keyed to demonic magic. Human or dragon magic might disrupt them. Sparky, sensing his thoughts, rumbled softly. Asterisk first, get closer. Then, create a distraction. Extract Ilara. Deal with Malaker if necessary, asterisk. The plan formed in his mind with the ease of long practice. But as he prepared to move, Malaker did something unexpected. He raised a hand, and the air around the cave shimmered. An illusion dropped, revealing not just a cave, but a complex of structures carved into the mountain: barracks, a forge, even a crude training yard. And at the center, pulsing with malevolent energy, stood a ritual circle. Malaker wasn't just hiding. He was preparing something. Kael's eyes narrowed. The ritual circle was designed for sacrifice, specifically, a sacrifice of life force to power a dimensional breach. To bypass the Aegis, Malaker needed enough energy to tear a hole in reality from the inside. And Ilara, with her natural affinity for earth magic and life energy, would be the perfect catalyst. Time was shorter than he'd thought. He glanced at Sparky. The dragon's eyes were fixed on the ritual circle, its scales darkening as if absorbing the ambient malice. A low growl built in its throat, a sound that made the very air tremble. Easy, Kael whispered. We do this smart. But as he watched Malaker gesture to his subordinates, pointing toward the cage with clear instructions, Kael knew smart might have to wait. The ritual was already being prepared. Torches were lit around the circle. Demons began chanting in guttural tones that echoed off the stone. Ilara struggled against her bonds, her face pale but determined. Kael took a deep breath, the cool mountain air filling his lungs. Retirement had taught him patience, peace, the joy of small things. But it hadn't erased who he was. And right now, who he was needed to act. He stood, stepping to the edge of the ledge. Below, Malaker turned, his copper eyes locking onto Kael's with that familiar, infuriating smugness. He spread his arms wide, as if welcoming an old friend. Kael. Malaker's voice carried on the wind, rich with mockery. I wondered when you'd show up. Come down. We have so much to discuss. Kael didn't answer. He simply looked from Malaker to Ilara, then to the gathering demons, his expression unreadable. Quietus remained in its scabbard. Sparky pressed against his leg, a steady, warm presence. The hunt was over. Now came the reckoning. And as the last light of day faded behind the peaks, Kael stepped off the ledge, dropping silently toward the valley floor, his retirement momentarily set aside for the oldest duty of all, protection. The Shattered Teeth Mountains lived up to their name, jagged obsidian spires clawed at a bruised purple sky, and the air tasted of ozone and old magic. Kael crouched behind a fractured monolith, his breath a steady rhythm that belied the tension coiling in his muscles. Below, in a natural amphitheater carved by some forgotten cataclysm, Malaker's hidden base pulsed with malevolent energy. Torches flickered around a central dais where Alara hung suspended in a cage of crackling violet light, her face pale but defiant. Malaker, clad in the black and crimson armor of the Demon Lord's elite, circled her like a predator, his voice a low murmur that carried on the thin mountain wind. Kael's fingers brushed the hilt of his sword, a simple, unadorned blade he'd kept from his old life, now feeling strangely heavy at his hip. Retirement had softened the calluses on his palms, but the weight of centuries of violence hummed in his bones. He'd hoped to leave this behind, the planning, the bloodshed, the relentless calculus of survival. Yet here he was, drawn out of his inviolable sanctuary by the one thing he'd never accounted for in his retirement plans, a connection. Alara's herb basket lay overturned near the cage, spilling moonblossoms and witchroot across the stone. She'd been gathering them for his tea blends, a small kindness that had become a weekly ritual. The sight tightened something in Kael's chest, a foreign, unwelcome pang. He pushed it down, focusing on the tactical layout. A dozen of Malaker's elite warriors stood guard at the perimeter, their forms shrouded in shadow cloaks that blurred their edges. More lurked in the crevices of the amphitheater, their presence like pinpricks of cold in Kael's heightened senses. At the far end, a crude altar glowed with runes, pulsing in time with Malaker's chanting. A dimensional breach, Kael realized. Not just a kidnapping, a gambit to tear a hole in reality itself, using Alara's life force as fuel. Time to remind them why they used to fear me, Kael thought, a wry smile touching his lips. He'd spent months teaching Sparky to fetch, brewing tea, and pruning magical hydrangeas. This would be a change of pace. He moved without sound, a ghost in the twilight. The first guard never saw him. Kael's blade flashed, a precise strike to the temple that dropped the demon into unconsciousness. He caught the body, lowering it gently behind a rock. No need for killing if he could avoid it, retirement had given him a distaste for unnecessary mess. The second guard turned, eyes widening, but Kael was already there, a palm strike to the throat silencing him. He moved through the perimeter like a breeze, disabling 3 more before an alarm finally rang out, a sharp, discordant chime from a ward Malaker had hidden in the stone. So much for subtlety, Kael sighed, stepping into the open. Malaker whirled, his face a mask of surprise that quickly twisted into glee. Kael. I knew you'd come. The great right hand, lured out of his cozy little farm by a mere herbalist. How sentimental. Kael ignored him, his eyes on Alara. She met his gaze, a flicker of relief in her green eyes, but shook her head minutely, a warning. The cage around her hummed louder, the violet light intensifying. Let her go, Malaker, Kael said, his voice calm, almost conversational. This doesn't have to end badly. Malaker laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Oh, but it does. You abandoned us, Kael. Left the Demon Lord's service to play farmer while the world burns. And then you find the world-ender dragon and think you can keep it as a pet. You've grown soft, old friend. He gestured, and the elite warriors converged, emerging from the shadows with weapons drawn, serrated blades, crackling whips, and spell staves. Kael counted 8, their auras sharp with malice. He didn't draw his sword yet, instead settling into a relaxed stance, hands loose at his sides. Soft. Kael mused. I prefer selectively violent. Now, I'll ask once more, release Alara, and I'll let you walk away. One of the warriors, a hulking brute with tusks protruding from his jaw, charged with a roar. Kael sidestepped, grabbed the demon's arm, and used his momentum to hurl him into 2 others. They crashed in a tangle of limbs and curses. Another lunged with a whip of living shadow. Kael caught it, yanked, and sent the wielder stumbling into the altar, disrupting the runes with a shower of sparks. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of millennia of battle, every step, every deflection, calculated to conserve energy and maximize chaos. Malaker watched, his grin fading into a scowl. Enough. Kill him. The remaining 5 attacked in unison. Kael finally drew his sword. It wasn't the world-ending blade of legend, that he'd left buried on his farm, but it was more than enough. Steel sang as he parried a downward strike, pivoted, and disarmed a demon with a flick of his wrist. He didn't aim to kill, precise cuts to tendons, pressure points, and weapon hands left warriors crumpling, howling in pain and frustration. Within minutes, the amphitheater was littered with groaning forms, and Kael stood untouched, his breath barely quickened. You see. Malaker spat, backing toward the cage. This is why you were the right hand. But it changes nothing. I have what you care about. He pressed a hand to the cage, and the violet light flared, causing Alara to gasp as energy siphoned from her into the runes on the altar. The air began to warp, a tear in reality shimmering into existence above the dais, a window into a swirling void that whispered of annihilation. Kael's calm cracked. Stop this, Malachor. That breach will consume everything, including you. I know. Malachor's eyes were wild now, feverish. But with it, I can bypass your precious Aegis. The dragon's power, combined with a dimensional rift. I'll tear your farm apart from the inside. All I need is her life to complete the ritual. He drew a wicked, curved knife from his belt, the edge glinted with poison and enchantment. In one fluid motion, he deactivated the cage with a snap of his fingers. Alara collapsed to her knees, weakened by the energy drain. Malachor grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back, and pressed the knife to her throat. Now, Kael, he hissed, his voice dripping with triumph. Your surrender. Drop your sword, deactivate the Aegis, and call your dragon to me. Or watch her die. Time seemed to slow. Kael's mind raced through options, a lightning strike, an illusion, a bargain. But Malachor's grip was firm, the knife already drawing a bead of blood from Alara's neck. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she mouthed, don't. The Aegis was back at the farm, a passive protection he couldn't extend here. His retired skills were formidable, but not fast enough to cross the distance before that blade bit deep. For the first time in centuries, Kael felt a cold trickle of helplessness. He'd built his retirement on inviolability, on the certainty that nothing could touch what was his. Now, in this desolate mountain basin, that certainty shattered. He looked at Alara, the herbalist who'd brought him rare seeds, who'd laughed at Sparky's antics, who'd reminded him that peace could be shared. Then at Malachor, his former lieutenant, driven by jealousy and ambition to this madness. The dimensional breach above pulsed hungrily, its whispers growing louder. Kael's sword clattered to the stone. He raised his hands, empty. All right, Malachor. You win. Malachor's grin returned, vicious and triumphant. Good. Now, the Aegis. Deactivate it. I can't from here, Kael said, his voice flat. It's tied to the land. But I'll take you to it. Just let her go. Oh, no, Malachor chuckled. She comes with us. Insurance. He tightened his grip on the knife, the point digging deeper. Alara winced, a tear tracing a path through the dirt on her cheek. Start walking, Kael. Back to your farm. And pray your dragon is as docile as you claim. Kael took a step forward, his mind working furiously. Surrender wasn't in his nature, not truly. But with that knife at Alara's throat, with the breach swelling behind them, he saw no clear path. He'd have to play along, wait for an opening. The thought galled him, he was the demon lord's right hand, reduced to bargaining with a hostage-taker. As he moved, he caught a flicker in the corner of his eye, a tiny, obsidian-scaled shape darting between the rocks. Sparky? No, it couldn't be. The farm was miles away, and the Aegis should have kept the dragon safely contained. But then a faint, familiar warmth brushed his senses, a protective aura that smelled of ozone and puppy breath. Hope, fragile and desperate, kindled in his chest. Malachor didn't notice, too focused on his victory. Faster, Kael. Or I'll start cutting pieces off her. Kael's hands clenched into fists. He'd get Alara out of this. He'd end this. And then he'd go back to his tea and his garden, and maybe, just maybe, he'd finally understand what this retirement was really about. But for now, the knife gleamed at Alara's throat, and Malachor's eyes burned with madness. The mountain base echoed with Malachor's triumphant laughter, a harsh sound that bounced off the obsidian walls. Kael stood motionless, his sword lying at his feet like a discarded toy. Alara's eyes were wide with terror, the poisoned blade gleaming against her throat. She tried to speak, but Malachor tightened his grip, silencing her with a hiss. Move, old friend, Malachor commanded, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. Lead us to your farm. And remember, one wrong twitch, and the herbalist dies screaming. This poison is keyed to my will, it'll dissolve her from the inside out. Kael's face was a mask of calm, but beneath it, his mind raced. Centuries of warfare had taught him patience, the art of waiting for the perfect moment. He'd noticed it earlier, a faint shimmer in the air, like heat haze, that wasn't part of Malachor's magic. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but to Kael's immortal senses, it sang of home. Sparky. The little puppy had followed him, somehow breaching the distance between the farm and this cursed mountain. The Aegis's protection wasn't just a barrier, it was a conceptual thread that tied to Kael himself, and Sparky, bound by that same protection, must have sensed his distress. As you wish, Kael said, his voice low and steady. He turned slowly, his boots scraping against the rough stone floor. The elite demon warriors, those he hadn't incapacitated, formed a tight circle around him, their weapons drawn. Malachor kept Alara close, the knife never wavering. They moved through the winding corridors of the base, torchlight casting long, dancing shadows. Kael's thoughts drifted to his farm, the quiet garden, the scent of brewing tea, Sparky's playful yips. That peace felt like a distant dream now, but it was worth fighting for. More than that, Alara had become part of that dream. Her visits, her laughter, her kindness, they'd woven themselves into the fabric of his retirement. He realized, with a sharp pang, that he cared for her. Not just as a neighbor, but as someone who mattered. The depth of that attachment surprised him. After centuries of bloodshed, he thought his heart had hardened into stone. Faster, Malachor snapped, jolting Kael from his reverie. They reached the main entrance, a massive archway carved into the mountainside. Outside, the night air was cold and crisp, stars glittering like shattered ice. The path down was treacherous, lined with jagged rocks and hidden crevices. Kael led the way, his steps deliberate. He could feel Sparky's presence growing stronger, a warm, pulsing energy that hummed just beyond sight. Halfway down the slope, Malachor stopped. Enough. Activate a portal. I know you have the magic for it. Kael shook his head. The Aegis disrupts dimensional travel within its sphere. We'll have to walk. It was a half-truth, the Aegis did interfere, but Kael could have forced a portal if he'd wanted to. He needed time. Time for Sparky to get closer. Malachor's eyes narrowed. Fine. But no tricks. They continued, the descent slow and tense. Alara stumbled once, and Malachor yanked her back up, the knife nicking her skin. A bead of blood welled, blackened by the poison. Kael's jaw tightened, but he kept walking. He focused on that shimmer in the air, now more pronounced. It was Sparky's aura, a protective bubble that extended from the little dragon, pacifying hostile intent. The Aegis wasn't just a shield, it was a force of absolute peace, and Sparky, as its beneficiary, was learning to project it. As they reached the foothills, the forest loomed ahead, dark and silent. Kael paused, pretending to catch his breath. We're close. The farm is just beyond those trees. Malachor grinned. Good. Once we have the dragon, the demon lord will reward me richly. You, Kael, will be remembered as a fool who traded eternity for a patch of dirt. Kael didn't respond. Instead, he reached out with his senses, feeling for Sparky. There, a flicker of movement in the underbrush, followed by a soft, familiar whine. Sparky had arrived. What was that? One of the demon warriors growled, raising his axe. Just the wind, Kael said calmly. But he knew better. Sparky was here, and the dragon's aura was thickening, wrapping around them like an invisible blanket. He could see its effect, the warriors' aggressive stances softened slightly, their eyes losing some of their predatory gleam. Even Malachor's grip on the knife loosened a fraction, though his resolve held firm. Now was the moment. Kael took a deep breath. Sparky, he whispered, not loud enough for the others to hear, but imbued with a thread of command that carried through their bond. Distract him. From the shadows, a tiny, obsidian-scaled creature bounded into the clearing. Sparky looked like an overgrown puppy, its eyes glowing with soft, cosmic light. It yipped playfully, wagging a tail that shimmered with stardust. The demon warriors stared, confused. This was the apocalypse beast. It seemed harmless, almost cute. Malachor's eyes widened in recognition. The dragon. Kill it. But as the warriors moved to attack, Sparky's aura flared. A wave of calm washed over them, so potent that their weapons drooped in their hands. They blinked, as if waking from a nightmare, their hostility melting away. One warrior even chuckled, reaching out to pet Sparky. The dragon nuzzled his hand, emitting a contented purr that vibrated with latent power. No. Malachor screamed, his focus breaking. For a split second, his attention shifted from Alara to Sparky. That was all Kael needed. He moved faster than thought, a blur of motion honed by centuries of battle. In one fluid motion, he scooped up his fallen sword, which he'd subtly nudged closer with his foot earlier, and closed the distance. The blade sang through the air, not to strike Malachar, but to disarm him. With a precise flick, Kael knocked the poisoned knife from his hand. It clattered to the ground, harmlessly. Before Malachar could react, Kael grabbed Alara, pulling her away and into the protective circle of Sparky's aura. She gasped, her body trembling, but safe. "You," Malachar snarled, his face contorted with rage. He drew his own sword, a wicked, serrated thing that gleamed with dark magic. "I'll finish this myself." The other warriors, still under Sparky's pacifying influence, stepped back, watching numbly. Sparky sat on its haunches, head tilted, as if observing a particularly interesting game. Kael faced Malachar, his sword held loosely at his side. "This doesn't have to end in blood, Malachar. Leave. Never return. You stole my glory. The demon lord's favor should have been mine." Malachar lunged, his blade a black streak aimed at Kael's heart. The duel began. Kael parried with effortless grace, his movements economical and precise. He wasn't trying to kill, he was defending, wearing Malachar down. Sparks flew as steel met steel, each clash echoing through the silent forest. Malachar fought with brute force and fury, his attacks wild and desperate. Kael, in contrast, was a master of control. He remembered their past, training together, fighting side by side in countless battles. Malachar had always been ambitious, hungry for power, but he'd also been loyal. Until now. "You've changed, Malachar," Kael said, deflecting a vicious overhead strike. "The army corrupted you. It made me strong." Malachar roared, pressing the attack. But his blows grew slower, his breath ragged. Kael's defense was impenetrable, a living wall that gave no ground. Finally, Kael saw an opening. As Malachar overextended, Kael sidestepped, his sword flashing upward. He disarmed Malachar with a twist of his wrist, sending the dark blade spinning into the trees. Then, with a swift kick, he knocked Malachar to his knees. The former lieutenant knelt, defeated, panting heavily. He looked up, hatred burning in his eyes. "Do it. Kill me. Prove you're still the right hand." Kael lowered his sword. "No. I'm retired, remember." He sheathed the blade, the sound final and decisive. "But listen well, Malachar. If you ever threaten my home, my friends, or Sparky again, I won't be so merciful. Leave this land. Tell the demon lord that I am neutral, but I will defend what's mine." Malachar stared, disbelief warring with fury. Then, slowly, he nodded. He knew he was beaten. With a last, venomous glance at Sparky, who yawned, showing tiny, crystalline teeth, he rose and stumbled into the forest, his warriors following in a daze. Silence descended, broken only by the rustle of leaves and Sparky's happy yip. Kael turned to Alara. She was leaning against a tree, her hand pressed to the small cut on her neck. The poison's dark stain was already fading, neutralized by Sparky's aura. "Are you all right?" Kael asked, his voice gentle. Alara managed a weak smile. "Thanks to you. And him." She nodded at Sparky, who trotted over and nuzzled her leg. "What is he, really?" Kael sighed, kneeling to scratch Sparky behind the ears. The dragon glowed brighter, its scales shimmering with inner light. "A friend. One who's more than he seems. I'll explain everything back at the farm." He helped Alara to her feet, supporting her as they began the walk home. Sparky led the way, its aura clearing a path through the dense undergrowth. As they moved, Kael felt a profound sense of relief, and something deeper. This wasn't just about protecting his retirement, it was about protecting a life he'd built, people he cared for. Alara's presence beside him felt right, natural. And Sparky, the dragon, was more than a pet. It was a part of his new world, a symbol of the peace he'd fought so hard to attain. They reached the farm as dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. The Aegis hummed a welcome, the gate swinging open on its own. Inside, everything was as Kael had left it, the garden thriving, the cottage cozy, the air filled with the scent of blooming herbs. It felt like a sanctuary, a fortress of tranquility. Kael settled Alara on the porch, fetching a healing salve from his stores. As he tended to her wound, Sparky curled at their feet, its glow intensifying. The dragon's eyes held galaxies, swirling with awakened power. It had grown during their absence, not just in size, but in presence. The Aegis had nurtured it, and now, something was stirring within, a potential for great good, not destruction. "Thank you, Kael," Elara whispered, her hand covering his. "For everything." He met her gaze, and for the first time in centuries, he allowed himself to smile fully. "You're welcome." As the sun rose higher, bathing the farm in warm light, Kael knew that his retirement had taken on a new meaning. It wasn't an escape, it was a choice to protect, to nurture, to build. And with Sparky by his side, its power awakening, its heart loyal, he was ready for whatever came next. The chapter ended with Sparky emitting a soft, resonant hum, its glow spreading across the land like a blessing, a promise of peace in a world that had forgotten how to be still. The first light of dawn painted the farmstead in soft gold and lavender hues as Kael helped Elara through the gate. The journey back had been silent, punctuated only by Sparky's occasional whimpers and the rustle of leaves underfoot. Now, standing in the courtyard with the Aegis's familiar warmth wrapping around them like a blanket, Kael let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Elara leaned against the stone well, her face pale beneath the dirt and dried tears. The kidnapping had left her with bruises along her arms and a shallow cut on her temple where Malakur's knife had grazed her. Kael's hands, once accustomed to wielding blades that could cleave mountains, now moved with surprising gentleness as he fetched a basin of water and clean cloths from the cottage. "Here," he said, his voice low. "Sit on the bench. Let me clean that wound." Elara complied, her eyes never leaving his face. "You didn't have to come for me," she whispered. "Malakur, he said you wouldn't risk leaving this place." Kael dipped the cloth in the water, the liquid shimmering with residual magic from the farm's enchanted spring. "He underestimated what retirement has taught me," he replied, dabbing at the cut. "Peace isn't about hiding behind walls. It's about protecting what makes those walls worth having." As he worked, Sparky padded over, nuzzling Elara's knee. The dragon, for Kael could no longer pretend otherwise, had grown overnight. Where once it had been the size of a large hound, now it stood nearly as tall as the bench, its obsidian scales catching the morning light in prismatic flashes. Its eyes, usually warm with puppy-like affection, now held galaxies of swirling energy, though the Aegis kept them soft around the edges. "Sparky's changing," Elara observed, her fingers tracing the dragon's snout. "Even I can feel it now. The air hums around him." Kael finished bandaging her temple and sat back, his gaze drifting to the dragon. "He's the world-ender dragon," he said, the words hanging heavy in the quiet air. "A creature of prophecy, meant to unravel reality. I found him caught in a trap, whining like a lost pup. I thought." He shook his head, a wry smile touching his lips. "I thought I was rescuing a stray." Elara's breath caught. "The apocalypse beast? But he's so gentle." "Thanks to the Aegis," Kael explained, gesturing to the land around them. "This defense system pacifies hostile intent. It doesn't just stop attacks, it soothes the very nature of violence. Sparky's destructive instincts are suppressed here. He's become what he always could have been, a creature of immense power, yes, but one capable of connection." He rose, fetching a kettle to brew tea, a habit that had become his anchor in this new life. As he set water to boil over a small magical flame, he continued. "I served the demon lord for centuries, Elara. I've seen enough destruction to last 1,000 lifetimes. When I retired, I wanted nothing more than silence. But Sparky, he's shown me that power doesn't have to be a weapon. It can be a shelter." Elara watched him, her herbalist's mind piecing together the clues she'd sensed before. The way he chews on enchanted tools. The way space bends slightly when he sleeps. It all makes sense now. She hesitated. "But what happens when others learn the truth?" "They'll never stop coming." "They already haven't," Kael said dryly, pouring tea into 2 clay cups. "But perhaps we can change the narrative." As if on cue, the gate's ward shimmered. Not with the violent assault of previous visits, but with a polite, almost tentative pulse. Kael sighed, setting down his cup. "Speak of the devils." Outside the gate stood Sir Gareth and his knights, but their posture was different this time. No weapons were drawn, instead, Gareth held a scroll case in one hand. Beside him, Arcanist Lyra waited, her robes clean of the soot from her failed rituals, her expression one of wary curiosity. Behind them, a small contingent of mages and soldiers stood at attention, but their eyes kept darting to Sparky, who had trotted over to the gate to investigate. "Kael," Gareth called, his voice stripped of its former zeal. "We come under a flag of truce. The royal court has reconsidered its approach. Lyra stepped forward, her sharp eyes taking in the scene, Elara bandaged but safe, Kael calm at his bench, Sparky nudging the gate with a playful snort that made the iron vibrate. "We witnessed your confrontation with Malakur's forces," she said. "Scrying spells picked up the edges of it. You moved like a legend from the old texts. And the dragon." She trailed off as Sparky emitted a soft glow, the air around him shimmering with protective energy. Kael walked to the gate, though he didn't open it. "What do you want?" "An alliance," Gareth said, unrolling the scroll. "The kingdom proposes a treaty. Your land becomes a recognized neutral zone. In exchange, you allow monitored visits to ensure the dragon remains pacified." Lyra added, "And we seek your counsel. The demon lord's movements grow bolder. Your knowledge could save countless lives." Kael studied them, his retired instincts assessing the offer. He could see the tension in Gareth's jaw, the knight still feared the dragon, still saw apocalypse in every scale. Lyra's curiosity was genuine, but laced with academic hunger for power. Yet their presence here, unarmed, spoke volumes. "Come in," Kael said at last, waving a hand. The gate swung open, and the Aegis's energy washed over the newcomers, a gentle but unmistakable reminder of the inviolable peace within. They entered cautiously, their eyes wide as they took in the farmstead. Sparky circled them, sniffing at their boots, then lost interest and bounded over to dig at a patch of earth where Kael had buried a broken enchanted compass. The dragon unearthed it with a happy yip and began gnawing on the metal, the magical energies dissolving harmlessly into his scales. "See," Kael said, leading them to the courtyard. "This is what he does. He consumes stray magic, neutralizes it. Under the Aegis, that hunger is directed, not destructive." Lyra knelt, her fingers tracing the air near Sparky. "Fascinating. The prophecies spoke of reality unraveling at his touch. But here, he's harmonizing it." Gareth remained standing, his hand resting on his sword hilt out of habit. "How can we be sure this will last? What if your protection fails?" "It won't," Kael said simply. "But I understand your fear. So here are my terms." He motioned for them to sit at the rough wooden table under the old oak tree. Elara joined them, her presence a quiet testament to the stakes. "First," Kael began, pouring tea for the newcomers, "this farm is neutral ground. No weapons, no hostile magic, no schemes. Anyone who violates that will find themselves discouraged." He didn't elaborate, but the memory of Malakur's defeat hung in the air. "Second, Sparky stays with me. He's not a weapon to be controlled or a threat to be contained. He's a living being, and under my care, he'll do more good than harm. Third," Elara spoke up, her voice stronger now, "the kingdom provides resources to help expand this place. Not as a fortress, but as a sanctuary. A pet cafe, perhaps, where magical beasts can be studied and healed. It could become a center for peace." Lyra's eyes lit up. "A research opportunity, yes, the Archmage Council would support that. But what of the Demon Lord? Your former comrades won't accept this easily." Kael's gaze hardened. "I'll deal with them. But for now, we focus on what's here." He reached out, and Sparky abandoned his chew toy to trot over, resting his head in Kael's lap. The dragon's glow intensified, not with menace, but with a warm, almost purring vibration that made the teacups rattle softly. "Watch," Kael said. He pointed to a withered sapling at the edge of the garden, a casualty of stray magic from one of Lyra's earlier failed rituals. Sparky tilted his head, then breathed out a gentle stream of shimmering energy. It wasn't fire, but something akin to liquid light. Where it touched the sapling, the wood straightened, leaves sprouted vibrant and green, and the air around it sweetened with the scent of blooming life. Gareth stared, his knuckles white on the table. "By the gods!" he whispered. "He can heal," Kael said softly. "He can grow. He can protect. This is what the world-ender dragon becomes when his power is guided by peace, not fear." The demonstration hung in the silence. Lyra was already scribbling notes on a parchment, her earlier suspicion replaced by dawning awe. Gareth slowly removed his hand from his sword, his shoulders slumping in something like relief. "We accept your terms," Gareth said at last. "The kingdom will recognize this farm as a neutral zone. We'll send envoys to draft the formal treaty. And I'll recommend the Archmage Council provide funding and materials for your pet cafe," Lyra added, her eyes still on Sparky. "But you must allow periodic observations. For science." Kael nodded. "As long as they're respectful." They talked for another hour, hammering out details. Elara contributed ideas for the cafe's layout, drawing on her knowledge of herbs and magical creatures. Gareth promised to post guards at a distance, not as a threat, but to deter any who might still see the dragon as a target. Lyra asked thoughtful questions about the Aegis's mechanics, though Kael deflected most, his retirement including a distaste for magical theory. When they finally rose to leave, the sun was high overhead. Sparky followed them to the gate, wagging a tail that now occasionally flickered with starlight. Gareth paused, turning back to Kael. "You've changed the game," the knight said, his voice grudgingly respectful. "The world won't forget what happened here today." "Let them remember it as a choice," Kael replied. "Not a surrender." As the gate closed behind the visitors, Elara let out a long breath. "Do you think it'll hold? The peace?" Kael watched Sparky chase a butterfly, the dragon's movements graceful and light. "For now," he said. "But tensions will remain. The Demon Lord, other kingdoms, factions within the Archmage Council, they'll test us. But we've planted a seed today. A different way of seeing power." He put an arm around her shoulders, feeling the solid reality of this life he'd built. The farm was no longer just a hiding place, it was a statement. And as Sparky rolled in the grass, his scales scattering motes of light like fallen stars, Kael allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. But beneath it, he felt the old vigilance stirring. The agreements were made, the alliances tentatively formed. Yet in the shadows of the forest, he could sense watching eyes. The peace was fragile, a delicate balance on the edge of a blade. And as the afternoon wore on, with Sparky napping in a sunbeam and Elara sketching plans for the cafe, Kael knew this was only the beginning. Retirement had become something far more complex than he'd ever imagined, a defense not just of land, but of an idea. And ideas, he remembered from his centuries of war, were the hardest battles of all. The morning after the tense agreements with Sir Gareth and Arcanist Lyra, Kael stood on the porch of his farmhouse, a steaming cup of herbal tea in hand. The air was crisp with the scent of dew-kissed grass and the faint, ozone-like tang of Sparky's magic. The obsidian-scaled dragon, still puppy-sized in Kael's mind, lay curled at his feet, its sides rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to sync with the gentle hum of the Aegis. Elara was inside, tending to the last of her bruises from Malaker's kidnapping, her quiet movements a comforting counterpoint to the weight of recent events. Kael sipped his tea, the warmth spreading through him like a balm. He had spent centuries in the clamor of war councils and the roar of battlefields. This silence, broken only by birdsong and Sparky's contented sighs, was a treasure he guarded fiercely. Yet, the peace felt fragile, like a soap bubble shimmering in the sun. Sir Gareth's knights had camped a respectful distance away, their white banners fluttering in the breeze, while Lyra's mages had set up observation posts at the forest's edge, their magical sensors discreetly scanning the farm. They were allies now, of a sort, but Kael knew trust was a currency spent slowly in this world. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden shift in the atmosphere. The Aegis, usually a passive, invisible shield, thrummed with a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through the ground. Sparky lifted its head, eyes glowing with a swirl of cosmic colors, not the destructive crimson of prophecy, but a curious, watchful azure. Kael set down his cup, his immortal senses sharpening. Someone, or something, powerful was approaching, and it wasn't human. From the western tree line, where shadows pooled thickly even in daylight, a figure emerged. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding rather than walking, its form shrouded in a cloak of woven shadows that seemed to drink the light. Kael recognized the style immediately, it was the garb of a high-ranking emissary from the Demon Lord's court. The figure stopped at the farm's boundary, just outside the Aegis's reach, and bowed deeply, its hooded face revealing only a glimpse of pale, sharp-featured skin and eyes that glimmered like polished obsidian. Kael, former right hand of his infernal majesty, the emissary spoke, its voice a melodic baritone that carried without raising in volume. "I bring greetings from the Demon Lord himself. May I approach under the banner of parley?" Kael folded his arms, his expression unreadable. He had expected this, Goritha's warning had been clear, but the speed of the response was telling. The Demon Lord was not one to let matters fester. "You may," Kael said, his tone neutral. "But know that any hostile intent will be discouraged." He gestured vaguely toward Sparky, who had risen to its feet, a low, playful growl rumbling in its throat that nonetheless made the shadows around the emissary flicker. The emissary stepped forward, passing through the Aegis's boundary without resistance, a testament to its non-hostile purpose. Up close, Kael could see more details. The cloak was embroidered with subtle runes of binding and communication, and the emissary's hands were slender, almost delicate, but marked with old scars that spoke of magical duels. It was a demon of the whisper caste, skilled in diplomacy and subterfuge. Kael had worked with their kind before. They were dangerous in their own way, but rarely blunt. "I am Vexus," the emissary said, lowering its hood to reveal a face that was both ageless and weary, with silver hair tied back in a severe knot. "His Majesty has been informed of recent events, the appearance of the world-ender dragon, your retirement, and the incident with the rogue Lieutenant Malachar. He wishes to express his displeasure at Malachar's unsanctioned actions and offers a formal truce." Kael raised an eyebrow. "A truce? After centuries of service, I thought my retirement was truce enough." He kept his voice light, but a flicker of old bitterness stirred in his chest. The demon lord had never been one for sentiment, every offer came with strings. Vexus inclined its head. "His Majesty acknowledges your contributions, but the dragon changes things. It is a power that could unravel realms. However, reports indicate you have pacified it." Its eyes drifted to Sparky, who was now sniffing at the hem of Vexus's cloak with innocent curiosity. The emissary stiffened slightly, as if expecting to be incinerated on the spot, but Sparky merely sneezed, a tiny spark of harmless starlight puffing into the air. Elara emerged from the house, her steps cautious. She had changed into a simple green dress, her herbalist satchel slung over one shoulder. Her eyes widened at the sight of Vexus, but she moved to stand beside Kael, her presence a silent show of solidarity. Kael gave her a slight nod, grateful for the support. "Sparky is under my protection," Kael said, his hand resting on the dragon's head. "The Aegis ensures it poses no threat. But I'm listening. What are the terms of this truce?" Vexus produced a scroll from within its cloak, the parchment dark and edged in silver filigree. It unrolled it carefully, revealing elegant, flowing script in the demonic tongue. "In exchange for your neutrality, meaning you will not ally with human kingdoms or interfere in demonic affairs, His Majesty will recognize this farm as a sovereign neutral zone. No demonic forces will attack or encroach upon it. Additionally, he offers a gift, seeds of the twilight bloom, a rare plant that thrives on ambient magic and could enhance your endeavors." The emissary's lips quirked slightly, as if amused by the idea of Kael farming. Kael scanned the scroll, his centuries of experience allowing him to parse the legalistic language quickly. The terms were straightforward, with no hidden clauses he could detect, a rarity in demonic diplomacy. The demon lord was being uncharacteristically generous, which meant he saw greater value in leaving Kael undisturbed. Perhaps he feared what Sparky might become if provoked, or perhaps he simply wanted to avoid a conflict with a former lieutenant who had once commanded legions. Kael glanced at Elara, who was studying Vexus with a herbalist's keen eye, then down at Sparky, who had lost interest in the emissary and was now chasing a butterfly with puppy-like exuberance. "I accept," Kael said, rolling the scroll back up. "But with one condition, this neutrality extends to Elara and any who seek refuge here peacefully. Your people are not to harass her or the visitors who may come." Vexus bowed again. "Agreed. His Majesty anticipated such a request. He also notes that your pet cafe concept intrigues him. He may send observers in the future, under peaceful guise." The emissary's tone was dry, but there was a hint of genuine curiosity beneath it. With the formalities concluded, Vexus handed over a small, ornate box containing the twilight bloom seeds, then melted back into the shadows as silently as it had arrived. The Aegis's hum returned to its normal frequency, and the tension in the air dissipated like mist in sunlight. Elara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That was intense. "I've never seen a demon up close without fighting for my life." Kael smiled faintly. "Vexus is one of the more civilized ones. The demon lord isn't foolish, he knows when to negotiate." He opened the box, revealing seeds that shimmered with a soft, violet light. "These will be perfect for the garden. With Sparky's magic and the Aegis, they might bloom into something extraordinary." Over the next few weeks, the farm transformed. With the truces in place, both human and demonic, Kael and Elara threw themselves into expanding the property. They converted the old barn into a cozy pet cafe, filling it with handmade wooden tables, shelves of magical trinkets, and a counter where Kael brewed his teas. Sparky became the star attraction, though most visitors still thought it was an exotic, well-trained beast rather than the apocalypse dragon. It would curl up by the hearth, its scales catching the firelight, while customers, a mix of curious locals, cautious knights, and even a few discreet mages, marveled at the inviolable peace that permeated the place. One afternoon, as golden light streamed through the cafe's windows, Kael was behind the counter, preparing a pot of starfall blend, a tea infused with herbs that glimmered like constellations. Elara was across the room, showing a group of wide-eyed children how to feed Sparky treats of crystallized mana. The dragon took them gently, its eyes crinkling in what looked like a smile. Sir Gareth sat at a corner table, sipping tea and discussing border patrols with one of his lieutenants, while Arcanist Lyra examined a wall hanging woven with magical threads, her fingers tracing patterns only she could see. It was a scene of surreal harmony, and Kael felt a deep, quiet contentment settle over him. This was what he had retired for, not just escape, but creation. The farm was no longer just a refuge, it was becoming a legend, a place where enemies could sit side by side without bloodshed, all because of a dragon that preferred belly rubs to destruction. Yet, as he poured tea into a delicate cup, his eyes met Sparky's across the room. In that moment, the dragon's gaze shifted, the playful azure deepening into an abyss of swirling galaxies, a glimpse of infinite power that seemed to peer into the very fabric of reality. It lasted only a heartbeat before Sparky blinked and returned to nuzzling a child's hand, but Kael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the tea's steam. The Aegis pacified Sparky's instincts, but it couldn't erase its nature entirely. Somewhere in the cosmos, forces were stirring, drawn by that power. Elara noticed his pause and came over, her brow furrowed. "Is everything all right?" Kael handed her a cup of tea, his expression softening. "Just thinking about the future," he said, his voice low. "We've built something good here, but legends have a way of attracting attention, both good and bad." She followed his gaze to Sparky, understanding dawning in her eyes. "We'll face it together," she said simply, and her hand found his, warm and steady. As the day wound down and visitors began to depart, Kael stepped outside into the twilight. The first twilight blooms were sprouting in the garden, their petals glowing with a gentle luminescence that mirrored the emerging stars. Sparky trotted beside him, its scales reflecting the colors of the sunset. Kael knelt, running a hand over the dragon's back, feeling the thrum of cosmic energy beneath his fingers. "Whatever comes," he murmured, more to himself than to Sparky, "will protect this peace. Retirement isn't about hiding, it's about having something worth defending." He stood, breathing in the cool evening air, and turned back toward the warm light of the cafe. For now, there was tea to brew, seeds to plant, and a fragile, beautiful balance to maintain. But in Sparky's eyes, that fleeting glimpse of infinity lingered, a silent promise that their adventures were far from over. The seasons turned with a gentle rhythm on Kael's farm, each day unfolding like a well-worn page from a favorite book. 3 months had passed since the truce with the demon lord's emissary, and the land had settled into a peace so profound it felt almost tangible. Morning light filtered through the leaves of the newly expanded orchard, casting dappled shadows across the cobblestone path that led to the farmhouse, now proudly bearing a hand-painted sign that read, "Sparky's Haven, Pet Cafe and Sanctuary." Kael stood at the edge of his vegetable garden, a steaming mug of jasmine tea cradled in his hands. The air carried the scent of damp earth and blooming night-bloom lilies, a fragrance he'd come to associate with contentment. He watched as Sparky, no longer the tiny obsidian-scaled creature he'd rescued, but now the size of a large wolfhound, trotted between the rows of enchanted carrots. The dragon's scales shimmered with a deep, cosmic black, catching the light in subtle prismatic flares. Its tail wagged in a steady, happy rhythm as it nosed at a particularly plump carrot, emitting a soft, rumbling purr. "Careful, Sparky," Kael called out, his voice mild. "Those are Elara's prize winners for the harvest festival." Sparky paused, tilting its head. Its eyes, usually a warm amber, flickered with a hint of starry light, a reminder of the infinite power slumbering within. Then, with exaggerated delicacy, it plucked the carrot with its teeth and trotted over to drop it at Kael's feet, looking up with an expression that could only be described as smug. Kael chuckled, bending to scratch behind Sparky's ear ridges. Show off. Training Sparky had become his primary retirement project. In the weeks following the confrontation with Malachor, Kael had realized that the dragon's abilities weren't just dormant, they were a wellspring of potential, waiting to be channeled. The Aegis of the Last Stand pacified Sparky's destructive instincts, but it didn't suppress its innate magic. If anything, it provided a safe container for that power to be explored. "All right," Kael said, setting his mug on a nearby stone bench. "Let's try the irrigation exercise again. Remember, gentle." He led Sparky to a patch of soil where newly planted moonmelon seeds lay dormant. Kael knelt, placing a hand on the earth. "Feel the water deep below," he instructed, his tone calm and instructional. "Not with force, but with intention. Like coaxing a friend." Sparky settled beside him, closing its eyes. A soft hum emanated from its throat, vibrating through the ground. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the soil began to darken with moisture. Tiny tendrils of steam rose, carrying the scent of ozone and fresh rain. The seeds stirred, and pale green shoots pushed through the earth, unfurling leaves that glimmered with a faint silvery sheen. Kael smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through his chest. Good. Very good. This was the new rhythm of their days, mornings spent in the garden, training Sparky to use its reality-warping abilities for growth and healing, afternoons tending the cafe with Alara, evenings sharing stories by the hearth. The farm was no longer just a refuge, it was becoming something alive, a testament to what could be built when power was wielded with care. Inside the farmhouse, Alara moved with practiced ease between the kitchen and the main cafe area. She'd moved her herbalist supplies into a sunlit corner, blending her work with the cafe's operations. The space was cozy, with rough-hewn wooden tables, shelves lined with jars of tea leaves and dried herbs, and a large fireplace that always crackled with a welcoming flame. Today, a few early visitors were already seated, a pair of royal knights off duty, sipping mulled cider and chatting quietly with a demonic scout who was sketching in a notebook. The scene would have been unthinkable months ago, but here, under the Aegis's protection, old enmities softened into wary camaraderie. Alara wiped her hands on her apron, glancing out the window at Kael and Sparky. A fond smile touched her lips. She still remembered the day Kael had asked her to be his partner in the cafe, his usually stoic expression betraying a rare nervousness. "I'm not much for business," he'd said, "but you've brought more life to this place than I ever could alone." She'd accepted without hesitation. In the chaos of her kidnapping and rescue, she'd seen the man behind the legend, not a retired warlord, but someone weary of conflict, yearning for simple connections. Together, they'd built something that felt like a found family. The bell above the door jingled, and Sir Gareth stepped inside, his armor polished but his demeanor relaxed. He nodded to Alara. "Morning. Is Kael about?" "In the garden," Alara said, pouring him a cup of spiced tea. "Something on your mind?" Gareth accepted the cup, his expression thoughtful. "Just checking in. The royal court's abuzz with rumors. They say the gods themselves are starting to take notice of this place." Alara's smile faltered slightly. "What kind of notice?" "Curiosity, mostly. Whispers of a neutral zone where even cosmic laws seem to bend. Some are calling it a miracle. Others, a threat." Gareth took a sip, his eyes serious. "There's talk of divine messengers being dispatched. Nothing confirmed, but I thought Kael should know." Outside, Kael had finished the training session and was walking back toward the house with Sparky at his heel. He caught the tail end of Gareth's words as he entered, the warmth of the cafe washing over him. "Divine messengers?" he asked, hanging his gardening cloak by the door. Gareth turned. "Rumors, but from reliable sources. Your farm's reputation has spread farther than we anticipated." Kael moved to the counter, pouring himself a fresh cup of tea. Sparky settled by the fireplace, curling up with a contented sigh. "Let them come," Kael said, his voice calm but edged with the steel that lay beneath his retirement. "As long as they respect the rules." The rules were simple: no violence, no hostile intent, no attempts to harm Sparky or disrupt the peace. They were enforced not by force, but by the unyielding nature of the Aegis, and by Kael's quiet, unwavering presence. Over the next few weeks, the rumors grew. Visitors to the cafe brought stories from distant lands, tales of celestial omens, of stars aligning over the farm, of ancient prophecies being reinterpreted. Kael listened, but didn't let it disturb the rhythm of their days. He focused on the tangible, teaching Sparky to heal blighted patches of soil with a touch, to encourage fruit trees to bear enchanted fruit that glowed with soft light, to weave protective barriers around the beehives that produced honey with restorative properties. One afternoon, as Kael and Alara were repotting some healing herbs in the cafe's greenhouse, a recent addition built with Sparky's help, Alara broached the subject again. "Do you ever worry," she asked, her hands deep in rich, dark soil. "About the attention?" Kael paused, wiping sweat from his brow. The greenhouse was humid, filled with the lush scent of growing things. "I retired to avoid worrying," he said, but his eyes held a shadow. "But yes. Sparky's power, it's like a beacon. The Aegis keeps it safe here, but it doesn't make it invisible. What if the gods want to take him?" Alara's voice was barely above a whisper. "They can try," Kael replied, and there was no boast in his tone, only fact. "But Sparky isn't a weapon to be claimed. He's family." As if hearing its name, Sparky nudged open the greenhouse door and padded inside. It went straight to a wilting sunrose plant, nudging it with its snout. A soft pulse of energy emanated from the dragon, and the plant perked up, its petals regaining their vibrant gold hue. Sparky looked up at Kael, its eyes glowing with satisfaction. Kael reached down, ruffling the scales between Sparky's horns. See? This is what matters. Not what others want from us, but what we build together. But the world beyond their gates had its own plans. A week later, the rumors solidified into reality. It was a crisp autumn evening, the sky painted in shades of violet and orange. Kael was closing up the cafe, lighting the lanterns along the path as Sparky chased fireflies in the twilight. Elara was inside, tallying the day's earnings. The air was still, carrying the distant call of a night bird. Then, a presence settled over the farm. It wasn't hostile, not in the way of knights or demons or mages. It was vast, ancient, and imbued with a weight that made the very light seem to bend. Sparky stopped its playful chase, head lifting, ears twitching. A low growl rumbled in its throat, not of anger, but of recognition. Kael straightened, his senses, honed over centuries of warfare, immediately alert. He turned toward the gate. There, standing just beyond the boundary of the Aegis, was a figure. It appeared as a tall, androgynous being clad in robes that seemed woven from starlight and shadow. Its face was serene, eyes holding the depth of galaxies. No weapon was visible, but an aura of immense power radiated from it, causing the air to shimmer. The divine messenger had arrived. Kael walked forward slowly, Sparky falling into step beside him. He could feel the Aegis humming at the edge of his awareness, a steady, impenetrable wall. The messenger made no move to cross the gate, simply waiting. "Good evening," Kael said, his voice calm. He stopped a few feet from the boundary. "Can I help you?" The messenger inclined its head. Kael, former right hand of the demon lord, keeper of the world-ender dragon. "I am Aliana, emissary of the celestial pantheon. I come with a request for audience." Behind him, Kael heard the cafe door open. Elara stepped out, her expression wary but resolute. She came to stand beside him, her hand finding his in a silent show of solidarity. "You're welcome here," Kael said, "as long as you respect the peace of this place." Aliana's lips curved into a faint smile. "Your Aegis is remarkable. Even our sight cannot pierce it fully. We mean no harm. The Pantheon has watched your endeavors with interest. The dragon's power, tempered by your care, has begun to ripple through the cosmic balance. We wish to understand." Sparky let out a soft chuff, nuzzling Kael's hand. Its eyes were fixed on Aliana, glowing with that familiar infinite light, but there was no fear, only curiosity. Kael took a deep breath, the scent of night bloom lilies filling his lungs. This was it, the moment his retirement faced its next test. Not with blades or spells, but with words and intentions. He glanced at Elara, then down at Sparky, feeling the weight of the family they'd built. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had ended wars and now tended gardens. "You may enter. But remember, this is our home. And we protect what's ours." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the gate. Aliana nodded, and with a grace that seemed to defy gravity, crossed the threshold. The Aegis didn't stir, the messenger's intent was pure, for now. As they walked toward the farmhouse, lantern light casting long shadows, Kael felt a familiar resolve settle in his bones. Retirement had taught him many things, the joy of quiet moments, the strength of gentle power, the value of roots over conquest. But it hadn't erased who he was, a protector, a guardian. Whatever the gods wanted, they would find him ready. Not as the demon lord's right hand, but as Kael of Sparky's haven. And that, he realized, might be the most powerful role of all. The chapter ended with the farmhouse door closing behind them, the night holding its breath, and Sparky's eyes gleaming like captured stars in the dark. The morning sun filtered through the enchanted willow trees that now ringed Kael's farm, casting dappled shadows across the cobblestone path leading to the pet cafe. Kael stood at the gate, his hands stained with soil from tending the luminescent moonblooms that Sparky had helped cultivate, their petals shimmering with captured starlight. Beside him, Sparky lay curled in a patch of sunlight, obsidian scales absorbing the warmth with contented rumbles that vibrated through the ground. At 2 feet tall now, with wings folded neatly against its back, the world-ender dragon looked more like an oversized, oddly shaped dog than a harbinger of apocalypse, especially when it rolled onto its back, begging for a belly rub. Elara emerged from the farmhouse, a tray of steaming herbal tea in her hands. Her hair, once tied in practical braids, now flowed freely, woven with blossoms that responded to Sparky's ambient magic. "The celestial messenger is waiting in the garden," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of tension. "She hasn't moved since dawn. Just stands there, watching the sky." Kael wiped his hands on his apron, a simple linen thing embroidered with tiny paw prints by Elara, and nodded. "Let's not keep divinity waiting. Sparky, come." The dragon perked up, trotting beside him with a playful skip that made the air around it waver slightly, as if reality itself were bending to its joy. They found Aliana in the meditation garden, a space Sparky had shaped by accident when chasing a butterfly. The stones now floated in gentle orbits, and the pond reflected not the sky, but distant constellations. The messenger was tall and ethereal, her form composed of shifting light and starlight, robes that seemed woven from nebulas. Her eyes, when she turned, held galaxies within them. "Kael, former right hand of the demon lord," Aliana spoke, her voice a chorus of harmonic frequencies that made the leaves tremble. "I bring a warning, not a threat. But in the cosmic scales, the distinction often blurs." Kael gestured to a floating stone bench. "Tea. It's brewed from Sparky-enhanced chamomile. Very soothing for existential dread." His tone was dry, but his mind was already racing. Centuries of war had taught him that divine messengers rarely visited for pleasantries. Aliana declined with a slight shake of her head, light scattering like dust motes. "I appreciate the offer, but time is a luxury we may not have. The void entity known as the Devourer of Realms has taken notice of your pet." She glanced at Sparky, who was sniffing at her robes, curious. "Sparky's power, even pacified by your Aegis, emits a signature across dimensions. It is a beacon. The Devourer feeds on such energies, and it is coming." Elara set the tray down, her hand steady but her knuckles white. "Can the Aegis stop it? You said, might not fully, in your earlier message." "The Aegis of the Last Stand is a conceptual defense," Aliana explained, her form flickering as she paced the garden, steps leaving trails of stardust. "It renders your land inviolable to hostile forces, magic, curses, physical harm. But the Devourer is not hostile in the conventional sense. It is a force of entropy, a vacuum that consumes reality itself. It does not attack, it simply unmakes. Your Aegis may slow it, but if it reaches the farm, it could drain Sparky's power, destabilizing the dragon's pacified state. And if Sparky's destructive instincts resurge." She didn't need to finish. Kael's mind flashed to memories of battlefields reduced to ash, realms torn asunder by dragons of old. He looked at Sparky, now chasing its tail in a circle, emitting happy little sparks that twisted space into playful knots. This creature, who loved belly rubs and dragon bone toys, was the key to either salvation or annihilation. "How long?" Kael asked, his voice low. "Days, perhaps weeks," Aliana said. "It moves through the void between worlds, but its trajectory is clear. I am here as an emissary of the Celestial Accord. We propose an alliance. We can lend our power to reinforce your defenses, but in return, we ask that you allow monitoring of Sparky, to ensure its power remains contained." Kael crossed his arms, the motion making his old sword, still strapped to his back, a habit he couldn't break, shift slightly. "Monitoring sounds like a polite word for surveillance. I retired to escape such entanglements." "And yet, retirement has not made you passive," Aliana observed, her galactic eyes piercing. "You defended this place against knights, mages, and demons. You rescued Elara. Retirement, for you, is not about hiding, it is about choosing what to protect. This is merely another choice." Elara touched Kael's arm, her warmth a contrast to the messenger's cool light. "She's right, Kael. We've built something here, a home, a family. If this Devourer threatens that, we can't just ignore it." Sparky, sensing the shift in mood, patted over and nudged Kael's hand with its snout. A soft, reality-warping purr emanated from it, and the floating stones in the garden began to spin faster, forming intricate patterns. Kael knelt, scratching behind Sparky's ear ridges. "You always did have a knack for attracting trouble, didn't you, boy?" he murmured. He stood, decision hardening in his gaze. "All right. Alliance accepted. But on my terms. No monitoring that interferes with our lives. You can set up wards outside the farm, and we'll collaborate on a plan. And Sparky stays with me, no attempts to control or move him." Aliana bowed her head, light bending in deference. "Agreed. I will relay this to the Accord. In the meantime, prepare." The Devourer's approach may manifest as strange phenomena, time loops, spatial tears, whispers that drive mortals mad. Your Aegis will blunt the worst, but you must be vigilant. As the messenger dissolved into a shower of starlight, leaving only a faint scent of ozone, Kael turned to Elara. We need to fortify the farm. Sparky's abilities, we've been using them for growth and healing. Now, we need to see if they can be shaped into a weapon. Or at least, a better shield. Over the next few days, the farm transformed from a cozy retreat into a bastion of cozy power. Kael and Elara worked tirelessly, with Sparky at their side. The dragon, seeming to understand the urgency, focused its reality warping in new ways. At Kael's direction, it reinforced the Aegis's boundaries, weaving layers of spatial distortion that made the farm's edges shimmer like a mirage. Elara used her herbalism to create potions that stabilized magic, while Kael dug into his old knowledge, rituals from his demonic days, repurposed for defense. One evening, as they sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the stars, Elara broke the silence. Do you ever miss it? The old life? The battles, the power? Kael sipped his tea, the chamomile doing little to calm the storm in his mind. I miss the simplicity of it, sometimes. A clear enemy, a straightforward goal. But no, I don't miss the bloodshed. This. He gestured to the garden, where Sparky was gently nudging a sapling into full bloom with a touch of its snout. This is better. It's worth fighting for in a different way. Sparky trotted over, dropping a newly grown crystal at Kael's feet, a gem that pulsed with contained cosmic energy. It whined softly, eyes glowing with an intelligence that went beyond animal. Kael picked up the crystal, feeling its warmth. He's trying to help, he said. Maybe we've been thinking about this wrong. The Devourer feeds on power. What if we don't just shield Sparky's energy, but redirect it? Use it to satiate the void elsewhere. Elara's eyes lit up. Like a decoy? Or a controlled release? Exactly, Kael said, a plan forming. Sparky, can you create a projection of your power, something that feels like you, but isn't? The dragon tilted its head, then sneezed. A small, shimmering replica of itself popped into existence, floating in the air before dissipating. Good enough for a start, Kael muttered. They spent the next week refining the idea. With Aliana's guidance, the messenger returned daily with updates from the Celestial Accord. They crafted a ritual that would use Sparky's energy to create a false beacon far from the farm, luring the Devourer away. It was risky. If the Devourer saw through the ruse, it might accelerate its approach. But it was better than waiting passively. On the eve of the ritual, Kael stood at the gate, Sparky by his side. The farm was quiet, but the air thrummed with anticipation. Elara joined him, her hand finding his. Are you ready? She asked. Kael looked out at the land he had built, the pet cafe with its magical beasts sleeping peacefully, the gardens blooming with impossible colors, the home that had become a sanctuary. He thought of the centuries of war, the retirement he had sought, and the unexpected family he had found. Retirement isn't about hiding, he said, echoing Aliana's words. It's about protecting what matters. And I'll be damned if I let some void entity take that away. Sparky let out a low, resonant growl, not of menace, but of determination. Its scales began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, casting long shadows. The Aegis hummed around them, a barrier unseen but felt, like the heartbeat of the land itself. In the distance, the sky darkened not with clouds, but with an absence of light, a patch of void that seemed to drink the stars. Whispers echoed on the wind, nonsensical and maddening. The Devourer was close. Kael straightened, his old sword feeling lighter than ever. Elara, start the ritual. Sparky, on my mark, give it everything you've got, but gently. We're not ending the world today. Just saving our little piece of it. As Elara began chanting, herbs and crystals arranged in precise patterns, Sparky focused its power. A beam of condensed reality, shimmering with cosmic colors, shot from its mouth, not destructive, but creative, weaving the false beacon into existence miles away. The void entity hesitated, drawn to the new energy signature. Kael stood at the gate, watching, ready. His farm, a beacon of cozy power in a chaotic world, held firm. And for the first time in centuries, he felt not like a retired warrior, but like a guardian who had finally found his true battle.